The first part of this section will focus on the global regulatory landscape. In this part, the prominent speakers, academics, and privacy regulators from a number of authorities will highlight the implementation of the APEC cross-border privacy rules system, the European Commission's decision of possible accuracy decision with trading partners in Asia and elsewhere, and also the practical and legal effects of data localization measures. Without further ado, may I now invite the moderator of this section, Ms. Yu-Ming Tian, the partner from Sydney Austin, to proceed onto the stage and introduce the speaker and the panelists of this section. Thank you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I am Yuet, and I'm from the US law firm of Sidley Austin. And I'm based in Hong Kong. I was listening with envy yesterday to some of the attendees to last year's conference in Mauritius. Somebody was telling me that, when they look out from the conference meeting rooms, they saw the beach. So I am very sorry for foreign visitors that when you come to Hong Kong, when you look out, you see pollution that we've transported from across the border. But anyway, in the spirit of, we're going to be discussing data transfers in the context of, in the Asian context. And in terms of the rundown, we have 90 minutes. One of our speakers, unfortunately, Gabriella Kennedy, she has had to drop out due to food poisoning, but we still have 9 speakers for the panel. And in terms of how we plan to run the session, we are going to kick off with a keynote speech by Ms. Julie Brill from Microsoft. And after that, we will be divided into 3 mini panels. The first one, we're going to be talking about data localization. We've changed the arrangement a little bit. Being, a partner in private practice, something that troubles a lot of our clients in the commercial industry are the data localization provisions that are being talked about a lot in Asia. So we're going to kick off with that. And after that, we will have 2 other mini panels discussing the adequacy and accountability frameworks. So without further ado, I will like to introduce all the speakers because I will invite them to come up here one by one. And then we'll kick off with the keynote speech. So in terms of the speakers that we have today, we have Julie Brill from Microsoft, and Nigel Corey, Mr. Bruno Giancarelli, who is the head of the international data flows from the European Commission. Next, we have Commissioner Raymond Liboro from the Philippines Privacy Commission. And then we also have Professor Miyashita from Chuo University in Japan, followed by Ms. Jennifer Stoddart, former Canadian Privacy Commissioner and a consultant now, and also Monica Tomczak-Kolikowska, who is from Shell, who's based in London. Last but not least, Jane Horvath from Apple. Julie, would you like to start the keynote speech?
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Yuet, for introducing us all and introducing our panel. For those of you who don't know me, I recently spent 6 wonderful years as a commissioner of the Federal Trade Commission in the United States. The Federal Trade Commission is the leading consumer protection, competition, privacy, and data protection agency in the US. Prior to that, I served more than 20 years at the state level in the United States, working with states' attorney general and their leading privacy working group. I was the head of that privacy working group. So I have nearly 3 decades of public service dedicated to privacy, data protection, consumer protection, and competition enforcement. As Yuet mentioned, I now join you in my new role as Corporate Vice President and Deputy General Counsel at Microsoft. I believe that makes me one of the regulated rather than the regulating. which is, after 3 decades, going to take some getting used to. Thanks to advances in cloud computing, data analytics, machine learning, and artificial intelligence, we stand at the beginning of a technological revolution, a revolution that promises to transform how people around the world live, work, and socialize. We connect with family, friends, and colleagues around the world instantly, without a second thought. We are truly becoming a global, interconnected community. But there is more to be done to ensure that everyone on the planet fully shares in this transformation. Economic growth, global health and human development, educational opportunities, and consumer empowerment depend to a large part on the movement of information in the form of data, across international borders. It's central to many of the services and capabilities we provide that consumers want and businesses depend on to run their companies. The decisions that regulators gathered here, the decisions that they will make in the coming months and years, will be critical to the free flow of data and the benefits that that free flow of data brings to people around the world. The rules and policies you adopt will have a huge influence on the degree to which individuals and businesses benefit from the technology revolution that is underway. Europe's General Data Protection Regulation is a great example of this. The GDPR reaches farther and is having a greater impact around the globe than any previous privacy law. By adopting this law, Europe has elevated the importance of data protection around the globe in a way that no other country or region has done before. GDPR's impact on how companies collect, retain, and use data has been enormous. From CEOs to line-level engineers, people at global companies are not just talking about GDPR, they are working around the clock to achieve compliance. This is a massive effort that won't end next year when GDPR goes into effect. Instead, it's a process that will continue and a way of thinking that is now deeply embedded in the cultures of companies like Microsoft. What I tell people is that we need to think about May 25th through Churchill's immortal lens. May 25th is not the end. It is not even the beginning of the end. May 25th is the end of the beginning of our collective GDPR journey. Now, companies aren't alone in needing to respond to GDPR's strengthened requirements. Europe's longstanding adequacy requirement for cross-border data transfers, which is now embedded in GDPR, has led countries around the world to review their existing laws and frameworks to ensure that data can flow freely between their country and Europe. Looking at the efforts on this front here in Asia, we see that East truly meets West in this endeavor. Japan exemplifies the kind of steps that governments are taking to create a legal and regulatory environment that better protects consumers and aligns with the requirements of GDPR. South Korea is also looking to modernize its data protection law in light of GDPR, as regulators there are seeking an adequacy assessment from the EU as well. While that effort moves forward, Korean policymakers continue to advance protections with respect to data, including new rules that give individuals greater control over data processing by apps on mobile devices. Now, here in Hong Kong, I know that the Office of Privacy Commissioner Stephen Wong is reviewing Hong Kong's the Personal Data Ordinance to determine what changes need to be made in light of GDPR. Now, and moving a little bit further to the West, in the US, Microsoft strongly supports the Privacy Shield framework between the EU and the US to facilitate data transfers. Last week saw the first annual review of the Privacy Shield, and based on feedback from government participants from both sides of the Atlantic, we're hopeful that the review will be a success. We may hear more from Bruno Gencarelli, who is joining us on the panel about this effort. The Privacy Shield offers a bilateral cross-border data transfer agreement that could be a model for other jurisdictions. For instance, the Privacy Shield may serve as a reference point for Japan in its discussions with the European Commission about EU-Japanese data flows, and for China as it evaluates potential mechanisms for satisfying its new cross-border data transfer restrictions. Other multilateral approaches, such as Apex cross-border privacy rules, or CBPRs, are also encouraging. Now, support for sound regulatory frameworks like the ones I've just discussed are not the only way that we can work to promote strong privacy and data protection for cross-border data transfers. Another critical issue involves the rules and norms relating to law enforcement access of data. On this issue, the issue of law enforcement access to data, Microsoft, like other companies represented at this conference, has played a leading role to ensure that law enforcement has appropriate access to data, while at the same time protecting our consumers and customers wherever they may be located. Notably, in 2014, Microsoft sued the US government to prevent a warrant from compelling the company to produce an email that was stored in a Microsoft data center in Dublin. We filed this lawsuit, which has come to be known as the warrant case, to protect fundamental rights of the EU legal order, as enshrined in the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the EU, as well as enshrined in Irish law. In July of 2016, the US Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit ruled in Microsoft's favor when it found that US warrants cannot be unilaterally applied to emails stored in other countries. In July of this year, the US Department of Justice asked our Supreme Court, the Supreme Court of the United States, to hear this case. Needless to say, the protection of Europeans' right to privacy will continue to be an important aspect of this case and a priority for Microsoft. The warrant case is significant because the warrant in question calls for extraterritorial application of a decades-old law that does not provide such authority, and because it ignores Irish law and the rights of those who own the emails. We chose to go to court because this case is an opportunity to subject some of the key issues that we face in the United States and around the world to the full test of the rule of law. At the same time, we are heartened that the US Congress is considering legislation to clarify how US government demands to access digital information should apply in the United States and abroad. The proposed International Communications Privacy Act would modernize the aging framework in the United States and provide a clear and fair legal process to protect people's rights when governments seek to access emails and other digital information. We strongly support passage of this bill. But when critical principles with important practical consequences are at issue, we will not hesitate to use the courts to protect basic rights. The warrant case is just one example of the lawsuits that Microsoft has filed against the US government. Last year, we challenged the US government's use of indefinite and overly broad secrecy orders to prevent us from telling customers when the government accesses their data. This case, which we call the transparency case, will go to trial next June. In a speech in May, China's President Xi Jinping spoke of an era of international progress and prosperity that flowered 2,000 years ago along the Silk Road that spanned much of Asia and Europe. President Xi said, "These routes enabled people of various civilizations, religions, and races to interact with and embrace each other with open minds. Along these major arteries of interaction, capital, technology, and people flowed freely, and goods, resources, and benefits were widely shared." Today, the internet is the vital artery of international interaction. Ensuring that data continues to course freely through this artery is essential to our efforts to nurture progress, expand opportunity, and promote prosperity. To ensure that these benefits are broadly shared and the opportunities equally accessible to the citizens, consumers, and customers that we serve, there are fundamental principles that we all must strive to honor and uphold. At the heart of those principles are the rights to privacy and data protection. To advance these rights, we must come together to create a world in which governments respect each other's borders and each other's laws. We'll need to hold multilateral conversations and craft international agreements that preserve the free flow of information across borders and stem the current trend toward data localization. We must enable data to be transferred freely between countries while ensuring that individuals' rights are not lost when their data crosses international borders. We'll need to fashion legal frameworks, both within our own legal orders and internationally, that respect timeless rights and values, protect public safety, promote the free exchange of ideas, and support fair access to the benefits of technologies. Now, while these frameworks must be crafted by governments and subject to the rule of law, it will be up to companies to translate them into systems and processes that touch almost everyone on the planet. None of this is going to be easy. The technology is complex, the issues are complicated, and the stakes are high. But I know that no matter which side of the table we sit on, we all share these same goals. I'm excited to be part of this journey, and I look forward to continuing the incredible conversations that I have been having with these issues with so many of you. Thank you very much.
Julie, thank you very much for the insightful opening address. And to follow up on Julie's remarks just now with regards to data localization. So in terms of the first sub-panel that we will have, and this is how we're going to run each of the mini panels. We will start off with one person starting off the discussion, and then there'll be a respondent. So for the data localization mini panel, we will have Jane from Apple, who will start off, and then she'll be followed by Nigel Corey, who will be responding. Jane, over to you.
Sure. Thank you for inviting me to join this panel today. As a company that operates in well over 100 companies worldwide with a sharp focus on providing the very best experience to our users, we are well aware of the need to manage data localization issues. At their core, data localization laws started out 30 years ago as attempts to ensure that personal data would be protected by the same privacy protections no matter where in the world it subsequently flowed. I agree with the policy aim that personal data should be protected no matter where it flows, and Apple has made that commitment to our users. Our users enjoy the same high levels of privacy and security protection no matter where their data is collected and ultimately stored. However, I do believe that data localization laws at present have become somewhat disjointed from their original aim. At Apple, we are laser focused on ensuring that your user experience is as seamless as possible. Whether you're playing a song in music, using Siri, opening a document from iCloud, or downloading an app from the App Store, to put it simply, latency matters. Therefore, a key question before us is whether the laws should determine where data is stored, or should engineers make that decision with the aim of delivering the fastest and most secure service to our users? I know the answers that the vast majority of our users would give. I also know that our users would also like one additional element, that they get the very best service with the very best privacy protections. As I said earlier, the debate on data localization has become a little disjointed from where it started 30 years ago. Time and the exponential growth in technology and resulting data flows have provided a different prism in which to view the issue. Take a primary school in Europe as an example. We find ourselves today participating in discussions with decision makers that conclude with a resigned acceptance that a data localization requirement results in student data being hosted on an unsecured server under a school administrator's desk, being more compliant than housing data in a state-of-the-art secure data center outside of Europe, even where the data has transferred legally under model contractual clauses, binding corporate rules, or the privacy shield to the US. That cannot be right. I know that some express reservations in relation to these methods of data transfer, but we at Apple certainly treat our use of model clauses with the utmost seriousness and understand the implications of failing to meet the requirements contained in them. While Europe has led on international data transfer obligations, others have followed. It is 3 years now since Apple was certified to the APEC cross-border privacy rules, known as the CBPRs. We put significant work into receiving our initial certification and our annual recertification as far from a tick-the-box exercise, with a full review of the steps we have taken to remain compliant. It is a system that works well. Of course, again, I know that there are some who see room for improvement, but isn't it better to set a baseline for what compliance for international data transfer across multiple jurisdictions look like, and then build upon that? A critical issue for those of us operating across so many jurisdictions is the compliance effort associated with what today are diverse requirements. I know that Bruno will address this in his remarks, but as privacy professionals and policymakers, it should not be beyond us to agree upon a system for mutual recognition between CBPRs and BCRs for a start. Those jurisdictions represented already have minimum acceptable standards for privacy protection. It is on this basis they are admitted to the Privacy Commissioner's closed session. Compliance efforts should be focused on maintaining and improving the privacy and security of individuals, not becoming distracted answering the same questions in multiple jurisdictions, or worse, continuing to end up in a situation where a school feels the safest decision for handling data is a server under a desk. Data localization compounds the already hard job of our security professionals. Creating redundant data sets increases the threat surface that security professionals work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to protect. Unfortunately, we are also seeing more laws and proposals for legislative solutions that require data localization that are not brought forward to improve privacy. These laws are often billed as privacy laws, but scratch a little below the surface and what you find are laws designed to ensure access to data for surveillance purposes. We are seeing data localization presented as a remedy to address apparent barriers law enforcement face from requiring access to electronic evidence stored across borders. There are even such laws in Europe now. This cannot be and is not the right answer. There must be a commitment to work together, especially government to government, to develop a framework for lawful access to data needed for law enforcement investigative purposes that will protect fundamental human rights and allow for the free flow of data, but at the same time preserve the ability of sovereign nations to protect their citizens. At Apple, we think of privacy as a core value, and it is fundamental to the design of our hardware, software, and services. Personalized technology must be private. Individuals must have control over their personal information. And increasingly, not collecting personal data is a default starting point. The use of cutting-edge technology should not compromise the position that our users' data is theirs, not ours. We have done it, and we will continue to do it, not because the law requires it, but because it is the right thing for our customers. We are clear that if we want our customers to trust us, that starts by respecting their privacy and doing everything we can to safeguard their data, no matter where it is stored. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jane. Nigel? Over to you, Nigel.
Thanks. Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about what I think is a critical issue for us all. I'll expand upon some of James' comments and also some that Julie mentioned in talking about data localization, where a country forces a company to store its data behind its borders for regulatory, legal, and other reasons. What we've seen in the last few years is a growing trend as dozens of countries across every level of development, across the political spectrum, enacting these types of barriers to data flows. It's a complex issue, and there's many sort of overlapping public policy concerns here, which I'll talk about today. Data localization measures target a growing range of data types, including personal data, but much beyond that. We've seen it applied to tax, financial, and accounting data, to public or government data, to data related to new digital services and telecommunications data. Whether you call it splintering, fragmentation, or balkanization, this trend represents a real risk to the global digital economy and data-driven innovation because it affects a core characteristic of the global internet, the free flow of data. When I last counted them up in May, I counted 34 different countries with data localization policies in place. China is a leader with over a dozen such policies, which it's continued to add to this year. Russia has an extensive data localization regime in place. Indonesia and Vietnam have both implemented a number of data localization policies. Other countries may soon be added to this list. Colombia's considered some data localization measures. Brazil's central bank is considering a proposal to force a local storage of all financial data. Nations generally base their decision on three main motivations when they're looking at data localization. First, out of a mistaken rationale that data localization will mitigate privacy or cybersecurity concerns. Secondly, some do so for purely mercantilist purposes. And thirdly, others do so to facilitate government access to data. As it relates to privacy and cybersecurity, and when we're talking about data localization, unfortunately what we've seen is that many policymakers are mistakenly believing that data is more private and secure if it was kept within a country's borders. However, in most instances, data localization measures do not increase commercial privacy nor data security. For example, when we're talking about cybersecurity and involuntary disclosures of data, i.e. security breaches, there can be there's really no matter, there's no difference, these can happen no matter where the data is stored. The confidentiality of data does not generally depend on the country in which the information is stored. What matters are the measures used to store it securely. A secure server in Brazil is the same as a secure server in Malaysia. Data security depends upon the technical, physical, and administrative controls used by the service provider, which can be weak or strong, and this is where the focus should be. The second common rationale is that some countries believe that they can use local data localization mandates to force high-tech economic activity within their borders in a new form of digital mercantilism, primarily relating to data centers, despite the broader impact this has on the rest of the economy. The third motivation, as Julie and Jane have mentioned, is about facilitating government access to data. And this can be for political or social concerns or related to cross-border law enforcement concerns. So just briefly, what do these policies mean for countries, companies, and users and consumers? One thing it does mean, as Jane mentioned, is that by potentially cutting off access to more competitive providers through data localization, you're forcing everyone in the country to use potentially more expensive and potentially less cutting-edge services and tools by forcing them to use local service providers. In this way, by impacting the cost of IT services, data localization affects every user of IT and data services in an economy, which in the modern economy is essentially every sector. This isn't just about tech. For foreign trade, cutting off data flows discriminates against foreign firms, especially for small and medium-sized enterprises and solely internet-based operations that don't have the resources to deal with the additional cost and complexity of dealing with these individual sort of data localization mandates. Data localization also affects innovation. Businesses use data to create value, and many can only do this, maximize this value, when they're able to transfer it freely across borders. The value of data comes from its insights, not from its storage. So what's needed to turn the tide? And that's what I'm looking forward to learning about here, but I'll add a few points that sort of build upon what Julie and Jane have mentioned. Firstly, there needs to be a far greater effort to talk about to build the level of understanding about the global digital economy and the value of data flows, and amongst policymakers and the public, and also talk about what's actually involved in good privacy and data protection practices. In regards to law enforcement, as Julie mentioned, there's a clear need to update the antiquated framework of legal treaties which currently are used by law enforcement to facilitate legitimate access to cross-border data to account for the digital age. It also requires, which is what we're here to talk about this morning and what some speakers mentioned yesterday, far greater effort to set new rules at the international level to support the free flow of data, including personal data, so that protection flows with the data wherever it is stored. This is where Apex CBPR comes into play, the US EU Privacy Shield, as well as provisions such as in the Trans-Pacific Partnership that support the free flow of data. And given that this will be the focus of subsequent discussions, I'll leave it here. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Nigel. If there are any questions from the audience, we would welcome them as well. You don't have to wait till the end of the panel. But I do have one question actually for Nigel before we go on to the next mini panel. And I think one of the reasons you mentioned, as you know, these data localization laws, they're often driven by for economic reasons or economic protection. And the other reason would be national security. So how would you be able to lobby or perhaps persuade, you know, a government that is actually against their interest? Or how would you get over that particular reasoning? Or is that possible?
It's a good question, and it's one of the parts that make this discussion so difficult, given the sort of knee-jerk reaction for so many policymakers is to store data at home. And in one regards, the best case we can make to try and convince policymakers that this isn't the approach is to focus on the value of data, the value of free-flowing data, and sort of what that means for the modern economy and for firm competitiveness and economic productivity. And by enacting these measures, you're affecting a growing part of your economy, and so thereby making it less efficient and less competitive. So that's one aspect. There also needs to be a broader discussion about narrowing how countries manage national security interests so that it isn't able to be used as a broad-based disguise for digital protectionism. And because countries are legitimately given sort of broad purview when it comes to national security, especially as it relates to trade and other issues, it's a tough one to tackle because it's a matter of filtering through what is legitimate and what isn't. And so you need to focus on the positive parts of how companies use data and the role of data in the modern economy, and that by enacting data localization, you're shooting yourself in the foot. You're not actually addressing what's helpful for local firms and local users, and then but giving them the space, but narrowing that space so that they can address those legitimate sort of areas of policy as it relates to national security and those sort of things.
Thanks very much, Nigel. Does anybody else on the panel want to comment on that, or shall we move on? Monica?
Yes, thank you. I think I still have the scars of the battle of going through a number of remediation projects for data localization. And I think, to Nigel's point, I think the adverse effect is actually that those countries will have access to less data than if they had a normal access to global systems, because you compartmentalize and you kind of segregate data and you introduce completely artificial data sets that are just being created in order to address those requirements, rather than having normal global systems that are working for the whole of the organization. So as a result of going through those projects, we actually realized that we got more segregated access to data that will prevent the governments in those localizations to get potential access. So there's a little adverse consequences of that. And of course, not speaking of the resources that have been diverted from doing real accountability projects to just meeting data localization requirements.
All right. Thank you very much. So for the next subtopic that we'll be discussing will be the accountability frameworks, and we're going to start off with Mr. Liboro.
Thank you, Yuet, and welcome everyone to the sub-panel on APEC and accountability frameworks. For personal data to be protected and privacy upheld, we strive to develop our own responsible digital citizens, accountable companies, and authorities that are enabled to protect data during its entire life cycle. In today's world, not every one of our citizens will ever get the chance to step out of our borders in their lifetime. But at least we're talking about their physical selves. However, there is a bigger chance that their digital personas will, crossing borders they themselves would not even be aware of, crossing borders even while they sleep. I have never been to Helen Dixon's country called Ireland, but I'm very sure my digital self have landed on its shores countless times. Free flow of information allows this to happen. Free flow of information means that you would continue to enjoy the value of data and innovation that have been created elsewhere to benefit you, yourselves, and that of your neighbors. But this should happen in a way that is secure for everyone, and that accountability can be expected wherever their personal data goes. And it is the job of regulators and authorities to ensure this. Thus, in a growing number of legislative bodies, there is a recognition of the dangers inherent in cross-border data processing, with concerns ranging from regulatory reach to national security concerns. As varied as these reasons are, they emphasize a need for a system that cuts across jurisdictions to provide baseline privacy standards that work with a multitude of data protection and data privacy landscapes. This need for that common standard can be felt most acutely in data ecosystems that are intertwined, where cross-border data transfers form a significant and growing part of the economy. Such is the case with the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, or APEC, and its 21 member economies. What is hoped for is a framework that sets a standard across jurisdictions that signal a safe environment for data processing, a standard that is measurable, predictable, sustainable, and most importantly, certifiable, especially for businesses. The Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Cross-Border Privacy Rules System, or APEC CBPR system, is one such framework. It is a voluntary system that allows stakeholders operating within its member economies some degree of confidence when transmitting data to one extraterritorial entity that processing will meet a certain standard. This way, the people of Japan could soundly sleep at night, even if their data is being shared across borders to other companies within the APEC economies, knowing fully they are secured with an acceptable level of protection recognized by their own authority as adequate. So I guess the central question here is, well, I believe the central question here is, how can accountability principles be operationalized that will ultimately result in maintaining trust among people and economies and across jurisdictions. The Philippines DPA is again one of the most, if not we are a startup, a newbie, if you may call it, and we have always benefited from the experiences of the jurisdictions ahead of us. And one of these jurisdictions is Japan. And they are enrolled in the system right now together with the United States. There are other countries that have lined up to apply, to enroll in this CBPR system. And I personally would like to know and understand how Japan is doing this and how accountability can actually be operationalized under the CBPR system. So I'd like to introduce Professor Hiroshi. Is from the Cho University from Japan, and he is an expert in the APEC. He's been an APEC expert and the CBPR proponent for the past 10 years. Professor Hiroshi.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Well, thank you very much, Commissioner. Thank you for having me this panel. Well, before I jump in to your questions, I would like to make a comment, including a fundamental question of data transfer restriction, because we have seen in Asian jurisdictions have different forms of data transfer restrictions, maybe because our privacy still is local. So my question here is, what is the legal foundation of restricting cross-border data flow? It seems to me that motivation of restricting data exports are diverse. For instance, some jurisdictions have restricted data export based on the economic or commercial interest, particularly in the context of a trade. Others may restrict the data export because of national security, in the context of government access to private data, as Julie mentioned. Others may be interested in the certification schemes as a condition for data transfer for trust building. And probably the most importantly, the data transfer restriction is justified on the ground of a fundamental right. So the issue of data transfer restriction is the intersection between the human rights and trade. As for the APEC, it is natural that the APEC privacy initiatives were triggered by the economic and commercial incentives. But I have seen year by year the APEC initiatives seem to be more in line with consumer protection and trust building. The second, about more in detail about the accountability principles. We have a certification mechanism in Japan, which I think has a growing attention, as we hear yesterday from the Singapore Commissioner. And we also find a certification scheme even in GDPR. During a decade of debate in APEC, I recognize that the APEC accountability principle maybe originally came from the United States or Anglo-Saxon, now becomes an Asian-flavored trust-making system. From our experience in Japan, a trust mark called Privacy Mark is widely accepted over nearly 2 decades. Over 15,000 companies are certified in Japan by this Privacy Mark, and its function, in my view, has 2 roles in practice: to make trust building in processing data and to ensure the technical technical level of security. And GIPTEC, accredited organization, started CBPR certifications last year. And I'm expecting that our Japanese experience of trust marking system and security standard will be spread in the APEC region. Now, finally and thirdly, as for the interoperability between the APEC CBPRs and the EU BCRs, I understand there are dozens of similarities between the 2 systems. But at the same time, the 2 systems still have a distance, particularly in the nature of binding force. It is, for me, but good news that the recent APEC meeting in Vietnam last month, they started a discussion of interoperability again. So in my view, personal data is not a commodity as such. It is something more imaginative, something more creative, and something more philosophical.
Thank you very much, Professor Miyashita. I have to say, I'm very grateful and very impressed with all my speakers today, because we were told that many of the panels overran yesterday, but we are doing extremely well with the timing, so thank you very much so far. I haven't had to use this once at all. So thank you very much. Are there any questions from the audience, or does anybody want to add to the accountability framework before we move on? Okay. All right. So I've got, I think we are going to go on to adequacy. So that will probably take a little bit more time. And I believe there'll be a lot of questions actually for Bruno as well. So Bruno's going to kick off the adequacy discussions, and then he will be followed by Jennifer and Monica. So Bruno, over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And often adequacy is, the EU is associated with adequacy, and adequacy is seen only with a European meaning, and this is less and less the case. So let's first maybe move a bit away from Europe and take a broader perspective. Today there are around 120 countries from almost all regions of the world which have data privacy law in place. Many more are considering adopting legislation in this field. And these figures have increased sharply in the last years. And this expansion of privacy laws is remarkable, not only from a quantitative but also from a qualitative point of view. While of course difference exists among systems, what is striking is that these new or modernized laws tend to be based on a core set of common principles. The adoption of an overarching legislation rather than sectorial rules, the existence of enforceable individual privacy rights, the setting up of an independent supervisory authority. I guess that this increased convergence is the best response to those that advocate a certain relativism, cultural relativism in this area. It shows that there's a way to bridge different legal tradition and universal principles, as we are talking about, and that has been said already, a fundamental human right. And again, this is not a European obsession. A few weeks ago, the Indian Supreme Court, in its landmark judgment of the 24th of August, recognized privacy as a fundamental right, an essential facet, I'm quoting, of the dignity of the human being. Another example or illustration of this increased convergence is the growing universal membership of the Convention 108 of the Council of Europe, with countries adhering to that instrument, the only binding international instrument in the area of privacy, ranging from Latin America to Africa recently. I believe, by the way, that the Asian and the Asian Pacific voice is missing in that arena, in that forum, and it would be important to see also accession from this part of the world. This developing convergence in privacy standards at international level offers new opportunities to facilitate data flows. As detailed in the Commission communication of last 10th January, and exchanging and protecting personal data in a globalized world, the European Commission is committed to intensify its work with third countries and international organizations in this area, building on and further developing elements of convergence between legal systems. This includes engaging with key partners, notably in Asia, which have developed privacy, a developed privacy regime to explore the possibility to adopt adequacy findings. Maybe let's very briefly recall the benefit of an adequacy finding. An adequacy finding essentially assimilates a third country to a member of the EU, to a member state of the EU, and that means free flow of personal data between the EU and that third country. Let me also say that an adequacy finding is not about looking for carbon copies of the EU system around the world. It is about looking for systems that, as a whole, using sometimes different instruments, ensure a comparable level of protection. And this renewed approach to adequacy, which we have, laid out in our communication has already yielded some first results with the significant progress made towards achieving the goal of adequacy with Japan by early 2018, as announced, and that in itself is a sign by Prime Minister Abe and President Juncker in their joint statement of last 6th of July. Similar talks are taking place with South Korea, and work is ongoing with some countries of our immediate neighborhood, our European immediate neighborhood. In parallel, intense work is ongoing with the concerned third countries. Many are represented here: Canada, New Zealand, Argentina, Israel, etc., to ensure the continuity of existing adequacy decisions adopted under the 1995 directive in light of the GDPR and the clarification provided by the Court of Justice. Concerning more specifically one of these decisions that has been already mentioned several times, the EU-US Privacy Shield, its first annual review has taken place in Washington, D.C. last week, and we will very soon, I believe in the second half of October, issue a report on the functioning of the framework. Too early, of course, to describe the content of that report, but I would quote the words of Commissioner Jourova, which is the member of the European Commission responsible for justice and consumer, which described us as our trip back from Washington as a trip that took place in a spirit of cautious optimism. But beyond adequacy, and that I guess is also a large part of our conversation today, the European Union system from its inception, and even more in our communication, recognized that there is no one-size-fits-it-all solution for data flows. We are working with stakeholders in the context of the implementation of the GDPR with a view to harnessing the full potential of the GDPR toolkit for international transfers. This may include expanding existing instruments, such as standard contractual clauses, or even developing new instruments, such as certification mechanisms, and that's where there might be a room for certain synergies with CBPR, to better take into account the diversity of transfer situation and the particular requirement of specific sectors or business model. Let me also say that greater compatibility between data protection regimes can significantly facilitate the much needed exchange of information between law enforcement authorities by contributing to build confidence between these authorities and enhance legal certainty, and thus create the condition for more effective fight against crime. In that respect, the EU-US Umbrella Agreement, which entered into force at the beginning of this year in February, could be used as a template for similar agreements to be concluded with other important security partners. It's interesting, the Privacy Shield has attracted a lot of attention, and sometimes the Umbrella Agreement is neglected, but the Umbrella Agreement is the first binding framework which sets safeguards, data protection safeguards, privacy safeguards in the area of law enforcement cooperation. Finally, and I'm getting to the end, when issues regarding compliance with data protection rules or security incidents such as data breach may simultaneously affect individuals in several jurisdictions, closer form of cooperation between data protection authorities, between supervisory authorities at international level can contribute to ensure both a more effective protection of individuals and a clear legal environment for a business operator. That has also been discussed at the recent meeting with the APEC data privacy subgroup in Ho Chi Minh City, and we confirm that we as Commission stand ready to work on ways to facilitate enforcement cooperation and mutual assistance between EU and foreign supervisory authorities, and the GDPR gives us new tools in that field. So I guess I have already spoken too much, and I will stop here, but as you can see, the adoption of the GDPR, its implementation does not mean that the EU now is going to sleep. We will instead intensify our international work, our international dialogue, which we believe is essential, as everybody has also stressed, in the borderless and interconnected digital world in which we are living. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bruno. Bruno, you mentioned just now a little bit about synergies between, the CBPR APAC framework and adequacy. I mean, can you be a little bit more specific about what else needs to be done on the part of APAC for there to be linkages between the two systems? I think there'll be a lot of people in the audience who will be interested in that. And Mr. Libora says he will take notes. Okay.
Probably there's work that needs to be done on both parts. What I can say is that we are certainly, with the GDPR, better equipped to work in that field, because the GDPR provides that one of the tools for transfers to be developed, amongst the that toolkit, that toolbox I was mentioning, you will find certification. And the APEC system is very much of a system based on certification. And we have, in our communication and in the context of the meeting that took place in August, signaled certainly our interest to explore synergies. I think it's much too early to be clear. I'm trying to answer to your question, to talk about mutual recognition. There are differences between the two regimes. Some differences are also relevant in terms of safeguards, in terms of exercise of individual rights, in terms of enforcement. That doesn't mean, again, and we have seen and we have worked with other systems, that there are ways to bridge certain of these differences. The next year will be very important for us, because we will develop our certification regimes and regime in the EU. And as part of our work, we are looking at examples around the world, so that we are not simply reinventing, we are not always reinventing the wheel. We are looking certainly at the Japanese example. We are looking at example of certain of our member states. Certification today exists in certain of our member states, and we are looking at the APEC example. So I guess there are new possibilities. This discussion about interoperability has been going on for years, and I prefer actually to speak about convergence than on interoperability. And again, that's an area in which certainly the work will intensify, but I guess it's too early to speak about a certain type of result or outcome.
Thank you very much. Very cautious optimism. Actually, before I move on to
in this business.
And actually, before we move on to the response from Monica and Jennifer, I have a question for Professor Miyashita, and that's in regards to the APEC framework. I mean, do you see other countries joining the framework? Because, in a way, to get traction, you need more people to join. And so it's a little bit like a chicken and egg situation. So where do you see this going?
Yes. Before I mentioned the future, we must realize how far we have come during this decade. 10 years ago, only Hong Kong and Japan has privacy legislations in Asian jurisdictions. Now look at, you are here, so we have, many countries having privacy legislations influenced by the APEC privacy frameworks and also the CBPR systems. So I'm sure that Korea has such a strict legal regime, so they can share their experience in our regions. Also, Singapore is interested in sharing of a certification mechanism. Maybe we can have a collaboration with them.
All right, thank you very much. So Monica and Jennifer, over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to continue on this very, perhaps unusually for someone who's been through many data protection commissioners' conferences over the year, very optimistic and positive note. Continuing on the remarks of Bruno Giancarelli, I would stress that adequacy remains the golden standard and the privileged way of enhancing international data flows. There's low or no cost, there's no overhead. Would that we all be adequate globally. I think that's kind of a data protection commissioner's dream. And I am, as a former data protection commissioner, very impressed by the effort that's being put into adequacy by the EU and others. And this is very, very recent. And I think that we should all take note of this. A couple of people have said to me, well, you've been to so many of these. Do you see any change? Are we making any progress? What's really happening from one conference to another? And I think that the recent EU position on adequacy that I read about in January, that I listened to today, that I have heard corroborated by other people here and on the panel, is really a milestone in terms of international data protection attitudes and the putting into operation of those opinions. So I think we should take stock of the fact and be encouraged that we see the EU show us that it is willing to learn from its past experience. I set myself as a post-retirement exercise to read all the adequacy opinions. It took quite a while, and it was not edifying. I wrote about them with some other people. It was a very, very depressing overview of a policy area that really deserved better in terms of its initial objectives. And so I am hugely encouraged to see that this is now being, I think, totally revamped, that the EU and the unit which administers this part of EU law under Mr. Giancarelli's leadership is taking on the challenges of the diversity in terms of national cultures, diversity in terms of legal systems that often do not resemble Europe's civil law-dominated approach, diversities in terms of what are different social taboos. What is taboo in Western European society is not that in others, and vice versa. And challenges in terms of internal politics. I guess I could refer to the Canadian experience where there was a very unhelpful adequacy opinion which recommended constitutional litigation between the federal government and its province. That was really not a helpful way of dealing with data protection challenges. I now read that this whole area has been subsumed under an approach of public interest because what was at stake was the data of international athletes in an effort to keep control of the use of illegal substances. This is a major change, and I think we should all take notice of this. One area where I think that some work needs to be done, if I can say so, is the EU, and the EU is not alone in this, approach to dealing with the existence of national security systems. I read about what has been done in the law enforcement area. I think, again, you know, we should hand out many gold stars for all the participants in that. But if we think back a few years to the revelations of Mr. Snowden, there was much reaction as if this was a unique phenomenon, as if the Five Eyes exchange of data for national security purposes was something that nobody else had ever done or was doing elsewhere in the world. I know nothing about national security, but I believe that probably most countries and most large and important world players probably have very robust national security systems that eat up a lot of data, and that may include, may I say, the European Union. And so I think in the same way that we've made progress on adequacy, I think that we have to, as a global system, recognize that we do have national security systems, that our citizens' data are going to be imported to countries where these systems exist, and how do we put limits and recognize what we can do to each other's data. So maybe, Mr. Giancarelli, you could continue to turn your so far very successful approaches to this one. Finally, I'd just say that adequacy is not a one-way street. Those of us of an older generation, we're used to dealing with European adequacy only. I've been told that other countries are thinking like with data localization approaches. Colombia, I understand, has an adequacy approach. And I would just hope that this particular community and organization, the Privacy Community International Commissioners, can continue to help us work together in very positive ways, because data flow is important. We've talked about the commercial benefits of data flow. An area in which I'm working a lot now is in health research, particularly in genomics research, which depends on the free exchange and the easy exchange of international information about people's genetic makeups. This is incredibly important for humanity. And there isn't only data privacy is a fundamental right, there are many others, and one of those are the rights of all citizens to benefit from the discoveries of science. So for that reason, among others, let's all keep talking, and in the meantime, I think the European Union is on a really good path with adequacy, and please keep on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. Monica, over to you.
Yes, well, thank you, first of all, for being here on such an illustrious panel. And I'm going to be a bit provocative here to Bruno, and I'm glad that you've mentioned cultural relativism, because for me, the adequacy mechanisms from Europe, it was always a bit of like 19th century way of doing data privacy, about, Europe telling other parts of the world, what are you good enough? And it's always been a bit of an awkward moment when you have to tell people in the real world, because strangely enough, there are still companies that do some tangible products that you're either good or not good, because that's how they perceive being adequate or non-adequate. And telling a counterparty, a very accountable, self-certified, meeting all standards counterparty in a country which is not regarded as adequate, there's always a bit of, awkwardness in this determination. So I'm very glad that we're moving into a new world, a world not only that we're going to use the adequacy mechanism, but we're going to use certification. We're going to use accountability mechanisms to drive the ability for global data flows. I think this is crucial for companies that want to operate globally. And it's not only crucial for companies that are the dinosaurs of the binding corporate rules and the dinosaurs of the industry. It's crucial for the service providers that work for those companies. So, being a bit of a self-proclaimed speaker for this type of companies that operate in third countries, they need to have the ability to demonstrate that they are trusted partners that can receive data, and they will be able to meet the same requirements that are binding on the European or companies based in Hong Kong or companies based in Canada. So that, I think, is more crucial than the bureaucratic and formal side of data transfers. So very glad to hear that, and this is a very kind of optimistic, much more optimistic than the data localization part of this panel, that I think we're changing our perspective, and with the ability to do data flows differently. Because I think that the mechanisms for adequacy until now had not been giving data privacy a good reputation. It has been a way to divert scarce and precious resources to issues that had not been increasing data protection and the principles that we want to see our counterparts and ourselves to meet. So I think that this is a very positive message that we had to take forward about the ability to demonstrate the preciousness of the data in terms of how the two partners will work together.
Thank you very much, Monica. So just in case you're wondering, we didn't do it on purpose, where it looks as though, Bruno is in the hot seat because we've got two responses against, the the European Commission. But you should be flattered, actually.
It's much worse in Europe. So.
Okay, we're gentle here in Asia. Can Bruno, do you want to respond to any of the points that Monica and Jennifer raised just now? No? No? Okay.
I don't have much to add. As I said to the last point, we have always, and that connects with the, I think, the discussion on localization. We have, from the beginning from the inception of the EU data protection regime, we have always thought that we had to have a regime for constitutional reasons, as many other countries in the world, that is both ensuring a high level of protection and is open to transfers. That's why localization has never been part of the fabrics of our data protection laws, contrary also to other countries in the world. That's why it's not either you are adequate or you are not adequate. Most of the transfer are taking place, and Europe is today the biggest exporter of data. Most of the transfer are taking place towards so-called non-adequate countries on the basis of the other transfer. And the efforts in the reform in the GDPR was to broaden the tools, the toolbox, and to have new tools for basing transfers. That's why we have introduced certification, codes of conduct, and other tools also for transfer to regulatory authorities. So I share what has just been said. I think that we already have some responses to that. And our efforts as part of the implementation of the GDPR is indeed to try to develop new tools, because we understand that there are tools that are that could be adapted, better adapted to certain business models, certain sectors, and certain regions of the world.
Thank you. I understand there are the questions from the panel. Perhaps Jennifer can go first, and then Monica, and then Professor Miyashita.
Yeah. As a result of the time I spent looking at all the adequate decisions in the system, I came to have a keen appreciation of, may I say, Mr. Giancarelli, the opacity with which the European Union seemed to function at the time. And I'm just wondering, going forward, particularly in light of the fact that now subnationals can be adequate, organizations, sectors, a lot of people have mentioned sectorial adequacy, if you're thinking of having a bit more out there for organizations, subnationals who would want to become adequate, you know, there's really not much up there. I checked last night, you know, could there be, this is the process, this is a checklist for what you have to do, this is how long it might take, and so on, you know, so the whole world could see, and particularly all the countries and maybe cities who would like to become adequate in terms of trade purposes would know, and this is the person who will answer your questions. I mean, there were terrible stories in the past of, you know, there would be nobody in the European Union who could answer a country's question that was trying to become adequate. So can I put that on the table as maybe a question and a suggestion for going forward, that you provide that help?
So that's the old question. The Europe, which phone number, the Kissinger first. So the GDPR has an Article 45, which builds very much on the practice that has been developed throughout the years and codifies the criteria that have been developed, in particular by the Article 29, which is the body that brings together our data protection authorities. It also codifies requirements coming from the Court of Justice. You mentioned national security, access, the conditions, the safeguards, and the redress and remedies available in that area have to be an essential part and are an essential part of our adequacy findings. So I think that in terms of transparency, there is a bit more in the legislation itself. Since the beginning, that has been the case for Canada. For instance, we had based our adequacy talks on an opinion that was developed by the Article 29 Working Party, actually in its first years of existence, because this was from the beginning a very important issue, which is called Opinion 12. And the Article 29 is now reviewing that opinion to better integrate, reflect the criteria, the elements of novelty that are coming from the GDPR. The process is a process that's the, I would say, challenge of any international negotiations, where you need some informal discussions before the two parties go out there and say we are interested by that. But I must say that in the years, the process has become much more transparent. If you think about the Privacy Shield, the number of parliamentary hearings in Europe, contribution of stakeholders, civil society, and others, that also simply reflects that while those discussions were very technical and had a technical dimension and concerned few experts even 5 or 10 years ago, now the political sensitivity, I would say almost the societal attention to these issues is so that they are, by definition, you have a more transparent process if you want to have a good and a stable and a sustainable outcome. The Privacy Shield annual review, and my interlocutors and friends from the US administration, some of them are sitting in the room, was, I think, an example of how we have to make that process more transparent. There was broad consultation of all stakeholders involved, from civil society to industry, in preparation of the annual review, and I think even the White House statement has stressed the importance of that consultation. So maybe we are not yet there, but I think there has been a lot of progress from that point of view.
Thank you very much. Monica?
Just saying that I'm very glad to hear that Europe is not contemplating data localization, but in the real world, the safe harbor decision was a bit like data localization. The EU model clauses decision that we will see in the future, that may be a bit akin to data localization, because if you're removing a number of options to legalize transfers, that is ultimately leading to some kind of adverse consequences in terms of, where you're able to transfer data. So I think we need to be kind of very clear that we need to promote mechanisms that allow for accountable transfers and allow the companies that have no influence over the fact how national security is being driven to still be able to progress and thrive in the global kind of connected world.
Thank you. Professor Miyashita.
Yes, I have one particular question to Bruno. I am interested in hearing your view on the partial adequacy. Jennifer already mentioned. Is it still possible, is it still effective that the partial adequacy, particularly in the commercial or private sector only, since after the Schrems case, or maybe the Canadian PNR case by the Court of Justice of the European Union in the context of government access to private data, public sector and private sectors are more and more intent to it.
Is your question, sorry, I'm not sure, is your question about whether in partial adequacy we also have to consider those aspects of law enforcement or national security access? To have? Yes, well, certainly, first, again, partial adequacy is something that has been developed in practice. The Canadian, if you want, the adequacy decision is a partial adequacy decision. The Privacy Shield is a partial adequacy decision because it concerns only a certain number of companies which decide to subject themselves to a certain number of obligations. It is clear that whether the adequacy is partial or not, you will always have, if you want, again, a decision which is sustainable from a legal and political point of view, you will always have to assess also those aspects that concerns public access to data which is processed by that sector, by that region, by that federal entity. We simply believe that partial adequacy is indeed, or geographic, which could be sector-specific or geographic specific, I mean, limited to certain geographic areas or industry, is a further element of flexibility of an adequacy decision. That can be required in light of elements such as, for instance, the nature and state of development of privacy regime, the constitutional structure of a country, whether certain sectors of the economy are particularly exposed to data flows in a certain economy, and therefore are, I would say, prepared to do that extra efforts. So that's what partial adequacy, but the basic elements, including the fact that you have to assess the conditions and safeguard under which access by public authority happens, is of course part of any adequacy finding, including in case of partial adequacy. Let me maybe just echo. It's difficult for me to see how the Privacy Shield or working on convergence can be assimilated to promoting data localization. On the contrary, I think that it's only by working on that convergence and working on common standards and trying to influence those common standards at a time where there's real demand for privacy standards, that's the best response to tendencies of protectionist tendencies that use actually privacy as a pretext or as a cover to do something else. And I think we have, and that's this is, I think, part of our discussion with the US, with Japan, and with others. It's better that we work on those forms of convergence rather than others setting those standards in a very different direction. So on that, I must say, I firmly disagree.
Thank you very much, Bruno. We have a question from the audience. Can you identify yourself and where you're from? Thank you.
I'm from Peking University of China. I have one question for panelists. On June this year, Estonia and Luxembourg signed agreement, so Estonia will open the first digital or data embassy in Luxembourg 2018. The location has been kept secret purposefully. And I think the rationale behind this project, according to the announcement of the government, is to maintain the full function of the government in the wake of cyber attack or earthquake or something. And they actually choose between cloud, and they do it all between cloud, and they do it by themselves. And I quote, according to the ICT policy advisor of the government, they say that actually the cloud technology provides a good opportunity, but the state also went to maintain the full control and jurisdiction of the data and the system. For this reason, the private cloud services are not exactly suitable for us. Therefore, we started to develop and enhance the data embassy concept. Just like Estonia embassy abroad, these are our sovereign embassy in foreign data centers. So I'm wondering your comments on this, because it seems to me that it's not just about national security data they are trying to keep in their foreign data embassy. It's more than that. And of course, they evaluate the argument that the security actually doesn't depend on the location. So I'm wondering, what's your comment on this phenomenon? Thanks.
Nigel, go ahead.
I'm less familiar with the specifics of that case, but I understand the nature of your question, and it seems that when we talk about data localization and cloud security, while cloud security does not guarantee security, it does tend to provide better data security as compared to sort of an individual firm trying to maintain its own server, because good data protection requires resources and expertise, which large company providers have in comparison to sort of small firms. And as I understand sort of the nature of your question, it's not that cloud providers, private cloud providers can't provide good security. Their main driving concern there is control, which is a element to data localization that we see in many places. I'm not. I don't know the specifics of the type of data that they're trying to back up there, but that focus on control is a key part of the data localization question, because, and I'll relate it to sort of what I'm more familiar with, is that when you look at countries that have enacted data localization because of prudential or regulatory concerns for financial or banking or whatever, and I mean the United States had sort of flirted with this by exempting financial data from the Trans-Pacific Partnership sort of rules on allowing free flow of data. That stands in contrast to countries that have legally mandated timely access to data if required by regulators. And that's where when we look at it, that's where we think the attention should be. It seems that the control aspect of your question sort of relates to what we sort of mentioned here earlier in terms of control equaling sort of national security concerns, which is part of the complex sort of debate around data issues regarding sort of public data, like you mentioned there. So that's the purview for each individual country to determine what they mean by national security. But the risk is that countries define national security so broadly beyond sort of core, what would traditionally be considered core issues, to greatly expand into many areas which are essentially commercial. And that's the risk that we face here with those types, the issue that you're sort of dialed in on there with that case.
Okay, Nigel, thanks very much. So before we end, we run out of time. Julie, do you have any closing comments before we finish up, or?
I was actually going to respond on the cloud issue, but I think we can raise that issue up a little bit further. What we haven't spoken that much about at this conference generally is the relationship between data security and privacy. And data security is a very, very important component of privacy. And one of the things that I am also not as familiar with that case study as perhaps I ought to be, or as I wish I were. But the concern, I think, is the extent to which entities that are operating individually and trying to protect citizens' data, do they actually have the tools to do this? Similarly, do they have the tools to really respond, for instance, to GDPR and all of its requirements? So one of the things that we spend a lot of time talking about is the ability of companies that are focused like a laser on dealing with security, dealing with privacy issues, being able to facilitate and augment the practices of smaller entities that really don't have the ability to focus on this. And that's really the power that the cloud can provide. And I think it's important for regulators who, I know when I was a regulator, not very long ago, I don't think I understood fully the power that cloud providers can actually bring to the conversation and the conversations that we ought to be having about security and privacy. So I'm really glad you brought up that example, Professor. And I think that, you know, as we move forward within a very, very complicated world where you not only have hackers trying to get into data and sometimes causing tremendous damage, as with the very recent breach in the United States, but you also have nation states engaging in attacks on data. We, I think, all have to be thinking about ways in which we can better protect this information, and tools like cloud can actually be a very key element of moving forward in this area. And also, these types of services can help with respect to privacy protections as well. As these cloud providers are processors for various controllers, the cloud provider can really help these entities beef up their compliance. So I'm really glad you raised it. I think it's an important part of what Brad Smith has called the fourth industrial revolution. Commissioner Wong referred to that in his opening remarks. And I think we all need to be thinking about these kinds of very innovative tools and ways to move forward in a complicated world where consumers and citizens and countries and companies are all being threatened from all sides.
Thank you very much, Julie. So we've come to the end of our panel. We were given 90 minutes and we've used up 89 minutes. So I'm very, very proud of this panel. Thank you very much. And the audience is very grateful as well, I'm sure. So a big round of applause for Julie, Nigel, Bruno Giancarelli, Commissioner Liboro, and Professor Miyashita, Jennifer Stoddart, Monica, and Jane Horvath. Thanks very much. Thank you, everybody.
We now come to the second part of this section. In this part, Hong Kong is taken as an example to explain how a sound regulatory regime, together with quality ICT infrastructure, can facilitate cross-border data flows and drive digital economy to go healthily. May I now invite our speaker, Mr. Herbert Cha, the chairperson of Data Hub Committee of Smart City Consortium and the president for UE Big Data Research Institute, to proceed onto the stage to give his presentation. Mr. Cha, please.
Good morning, everybody. It's my pleasure to be in here. We have formed a data hub community a while ago under the Hong Kong Smart City Consortium. The reason why we have formed this consortium, we have together with the Ernst & Young and providing a report on the growing development of the cross-border business and the advanced technology. And then we just wondering, we want to find out the possibility of building Hong Kong as an international data hub. So the topic has covered and the global trend of the digital economy and the current situation of the cross-border data transfer in Hong Kong. And perhaps it's also related to the multinational company in Hong Kong as well for the free data flow that we were just talking about in the last 90 minutes. So needless to say, this is important for the digital economy where we have a lot of more free data flow in between countries. And as you can see, the cross-border transfer framework is actually coming from the 1980 to 2017 and 18, where the China Border Transfer Security Assessment and as also as the GDPR is coming. In the advisory report, we've actually coming into some of the scenarios, such as the international company with an office in Hong Kong, China, as well as other region. It connects data in mainland China storing in the China. The data has to be required to transfer to the system hosted in the other region. That's one of the important cases where a lot of the multinational company has concern on how is the data going to flow in between from China to Hong Kong afterward. So this is something that we have mentioned in the advisory report and see if Hong Kong has a position to simplify the process for the data to transferring from mainland to Hong Kong. Second case will be a company outside China collecting data from China via system host in Hong Kong. And while the system is transferring back to the backend system for the overseas employee, which is also makes sense for most of the overseas company as well. Then we have come to something like a company outside China collecting data from China, but store it in the cloud platform where it may be staying in storing in Hong Kong or other region. And then there's a four-case service vendor located outside China whom need to access to the data, which is also a majority of the company has this need to doing this. So what we try to do in Hong Kong is that the concept of the hub, international data hub as a neutral place recognized. We want to build that such that the multi-jurisdiction to maintain the process data in a secure manner. But most importantly, we want to facilitate safe, effective, and efficient data handling, and in a much more simple way. And the expected key benefit is actually how would be the case that I just mentioned. The fourth case I just mentioned previously can be have a much simplified process. So the inherent advantage of Hong Kong as a data hub is because of we used to be we are an international hub which has a very good legal system. For example, the personal data audiences we have that since the 1996, and as well as the talent who has a lot of experience between West and the East. With the different handling with the different culture and the technology, the data technology or the information technology that we have come across with a reliable supplier and the telecommunication infrastructure in Asian Pacific. But we are equipped with that in our inherent as a information technology hub. But with the evolution of the big data, actually data is actually connected together, and we need a lot of data flow in between devices. As well as the evolution of AI, you will see that for the future, for the AI and the big data, we need to have a much more feasible data hub in the area. So our suggestion for the next step is actually to having a task force formulated in Hong Kong to be an international data hub to lead the following activity. We want to develop a self-regulatory framework with a set of data protection requirements to assist the enterprise in Hong Kong to implement data protection practice, and also to act as a communication channel behind data protection practice with overseas and the mainland jurisdictions. And to facilitate the development of cross-border data transfer activity with effective privacy and security protection. Devote accountability of the cross-border transfer as our next step. We have a proposed governance framework. A self-regulate framework should set up a data protection requirement on cross-border transfer. Simplify the approval process would be established with the overseas and mainland jurisdictions. I think the way we are trying to do is that to establish such thing as an experimental zone with the company that's already talking to us in order to streamline the self-regulatory framework with China as a pilot one to recommend to invite selected enterprise with the cross-border list. And that is actually our proposal for the governance framework in the coming forward. And then we actually really want to invite more organizations who we want to participate in our proposal for the experiment. So we also wanted to invite more of the different commissioners from the different countries to work with us on how to format such a task force. Thank you very much. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Cha, for sharing his expertise with us. Ladies and gentlemen, here comes the tea break. Refreshments are served at the foyer area. And the conference will resume at 11 a.m. And please come back punctually. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. The theme of the next panel discussion is Challenges of New Technology. The first part of this section focuses on the ethics by design in AI. In this part, the prominent speakers and privacy regulators will share with us the privacy implications in the use of AI and the ethical issues brought by AI and also the possible solutions to them from experts. We are delighted to have Mr. Martin Abrams, the Chief Strategy and Executive Director of the Information Accountability Foundation, as the speaker. And Mr. Mark Van Hollebeek will be the moderator of this section. He is the Director of the Privacy of Microsoft. I will leave the time to Mr. Hollebeek to introduce the panelists of this section. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This session, entitled Artificial Intelligence and Ethics by Design, is really meant to bridge this year's conference with next year's conference. It seeks to connect West and East, discuss global values underpinning data protection, and review the Information Accountability Foundation, or IAF, proposal for an ethical framework that preserves dignity and respect in our data-driven lives. With that in mind, the session is about participating in a year-long conversation leading us to the Brussels conference. The paper that panelists will be responding to was published on the IAF website last week, and I encourage you to read it. I'm Mark Van Hollebeek from Microsoft, and I'll facilitate the session. We'll have Marty kick it off by discussing his paper, but I want our panelists to join us now. We have Wojtek, Assistant European Data Protection Supervisor, joining us, Dr. Simon Longstaff, Executive Director of the Ethics Center from Sydney, Australia, Joanne Stonier, Chief Information Governance and Privacy Officer for MasterCard, and Warapat Patram, Director of Public Policy Southeast Asia for Intel. Marty?
Well, my many thanks to the International Conference of Data Protection and Privacy Commissioners and to our colleagues at the Hong Kong Commission for this opportunity to discuss data ethics. I would also like to dedicate this session to Joe Alhadeff, who recently passed after a long battle with cancer. Joe was a wise friend to us all. He is sadly missed, particularly this week as we debate today's complex data protection issues. And just a moment to honor Joe. Since the first conference 39 years ago, we have seen many disruptive technologies force us to think through how we apply the core values of data protection and yield a better world through data-driven innovation. Those disruptive technologies have come faster and have us reaching well beyond simple compliance with legal checklists. Companies that use data robustly have begun to understand that compliance alone is not enough. Numerous professional organizations are also offering guidance on how to think about ethics. Regulators are also looking beyond the letter of the law to find ways to facilitate the full range of human interest. The EDPS Ethics Initiative is just one example. A question remains to bring how we bring this journey by ethical business and regulators together and be joined by civil society. New and future laws require us to bring values to play, and values mean ethics. Next year's conference will focus on ethics and dignity. With that in mind, this session is designed to trigger a year-long conversation. It is entitled Artificial Intelligence and Ethics by Design. But what does that even mean? To help us get started, the IAF published a paper and supporting documents last week as a discussion starter. So first, why ethics? I think the answer is that with today and tomorrow's increasingly complex data use, the law alone as a definer of fair processing is just not sufficient. The evidence, the reliance of the new generation of data protection laws on risk, assessments, and defendable fairness. So what do we mean by ethics? One definition is the shared societal values that are often unspoken. As a company, how does one design in what is often just not spoken? And when I think about societal values, there are regulatory officials from every continent and sub-region here today. Which region's values do we incorporate? Is it a societal harmony from East Asia, or consequentialism from Europe, or a sense of duty no matter the consequences? So I lead the Information Accountability Foundation. Just as a carpenter first looks for a nail, as an accountability foundation, we start with the concept of accountability. When starting with accountability, we ask about what is new with AI. Some have described AI as putting a computer to solving a problem that we do not yet know how to solve. Computers will ping at a problem, trial and error, until relentlessly the problem is solved. Computers don't get bored, they don't get discouraged, they just try until they meet a stated objective. Furthermore, AI, when applied, can make decisions for people rather than suggesting the decisions that should be made. Collision avoidance braking was once an AI experiment. It is now the way new cars work. Increasingly, we want more technologies to simply take care of things. Unlike previous disruptive technologies, with these technologies, there's less of an opportunity for human intervention at the point of decision. This is often a good thing, but how do we provide assurance of fairness when how things work will be less obvious? And how do we build values into AI design objectives? Accountability requires data stewardship. To make accountability work, we believe stewardship needs an upgrade. It needs to be enhanced for this world where machines make decisions for people. We call this new level of stewardship stakeholder-focused stewardship. It requires organizations to be open about their values and how those values will be applied. It also requires companies to understand the stakeholders impacted by the AI and how they will balance the interests of the various stakeholders at least co-equal to its own interests. But every new governance structure requires guidance. So we've built upon the essential elements of accountability. The 2009 Essential Elements of Accountability informed efforts in Hong Kong, Colombia, Canada, and Europe to define accountability expectations for processing that is impactful on people. These new essential elements recognize that the custodian nature of the 2009 document is not sufficient for a world where smart cars, smart health hubs, and other smart devices make decisions that must serve a broader group of stakeholders. And those new essential elements recognize this broader group of stakeholders are many and diverse. Stakeholder analysis must be thoughtful and agile, and there are times when the interests of a single individual trumps all other stakeholders, and there are times when the societal interests have greater dominance. And lastly, organizations need to self-declare their values. If values are defined by law, that makes them laws. If they're defined by regulators, they're regulations. Organizations, by self-declaring their values, are making themselves accountable for their execution. And execution is actionable by people and regulators. So now we have stewardship, values, and direction. How does a company get from high-level guiding principles to the objectives that can be part of a code? The package we released has a roadmap for cascading values to ethics by design. The package we released includes a model worksheet to do just that. The entire package is intended to be a discussion starter. So Mark, let's begin that discussion.
Great, thank you, Marty. Wojtek, let's start with you. The IAF suggests that their proposal is consistent with the risk-focused direction of the GDPR, but they also say that the GDPR, like most recent regulations, are lagging behind the fast-evolving and compelling technologies we're seeing, like AI. In fact, they say that AI requires us to move into ethics. Do you agree? And is this proposal the type of work that the EDPS ethics initiative envisioned?
Well, thank you first of all for inviting me to this discussion. That is definitely one of the steps that will lead us to the broader approach to ethical issues, which we are going to take at the conference, at the international conference in Brussels in next year. Well, definitely we agree, but it's not surprising. Let me read a short text. Very consistency that makes artificial intelligence system attractive also guarantees a problem of inhuman and unethical design will repeat itself systematically. In order to justify any optimism that artificial intelligence system cannot have to high standard of ethical practice, close attention will have to be given to this consideration in the system's design. And the funny thing is that this text have been written by Michael Victorov in 1985. So 34 years ago, the questions like that. 2 years ago, when EDPS was preparing its opinion on big data, we have stressed that there are 4 layers which are absolutely necessary to discuss about the new approach to big data, to artificial intelligence, to machine learning systems. That's the future-oriented legal regulation, and that's what we have at the moment and what GDPR is. Accountable controllers, privacy-conscious engineering, and empowered individuals. So in order to empower individuals, you need artificial intelligence being engineered in an ethical way. And now we have to start to discuss what does it mean in practice.
Thank you. Dr. Longstaff, I'm curious to get your take as a philosopher on the approach the IAF takes to ethics in this paper. They do not advocate for the adoption of one particular ethical school, but instead propose that because ethics goes beyond the current state of law, the ethical approach taken should be left up to the organization to define and to appropriate into a series of policies and procedures. In conversation over the last couple of days, you've mentioned a conflict that you've seen at this conference between individual interests pitted against societal interests. And I know that you've been a little bit frustrated by that. And I wonder if the IAF proposal of stakeholder-focused data stewards helps to bridge that gap between individual privacy interests and societal benefits, and if they're navigating ethical theories the right way.
Yeah, well, thank you, and thanks to the organisers for the invitation to join you here today. It's right, I have been struck as a person who is not a native member of this this community about just how polarised the debate often seems to be, where it's put in stark terms between, on the one hand, the rights of individuals and the benefits of society, without there being a clear enough, in my mind, articulation about how both of these goods can be competing with each other, but both are goods which need to be understood and respected. But to go back to the first thing about, your question to Wojtek about AI itself and why it might drive the IAF towards the approach it's taken, I think we need to understand that the technology itself, with its power, defies the current responses that we have at the moment. Too often, the word ethics is used as if it's synonymous with compliance, particularly in North America. That has been the dominant view, where it's just about another set of rules imposed internally rather than externally. That's inadequate because of the depth and pace of the changes that are going to be made. But also, all AI is not the same. Some AI systems operate on Boolean logic, where you can actually track the way that it operates. Other systems, as we all know, particularly neural networks, will deliver an effective outcome, but without us actually knowing the processes by which they are able to do so. So when we come to the question of ethics by design, we have to see this, I think, as a socio-technical problem. It's not just about defining a framework of core values and principles that engineers and others design into the architecture at the beginning. It's also about building a series of systems in which humans continue to play a role, which brings me to the point that you asked about the notion of the stewardship and being responsible to people and the role of companies. I am someone who believes that it's essential, it's not merely an optional extra now, that within the, if you like, the ecology of business, whether it's a MasterCard or a Microsoft or an Apple we heard from this morning, that there be absolutely explicit outcomes in relation to what they define for themselves as their defining purpose, their core values and their principles. I'll take it for granted that obeying the law is a bare minimum, but you want to know that they are not just being driven by enlightened self-interest because they think that in the long term it will be good for shareholders and for employees. That may be true, but there must be a set of core values and principles clearly understood, which then allow people to make judgments about whether to deal with them or not, to understand how they're applied in relation to the systems, policies and structures they bring into existence, and which give a proper place for the data steward, who is somebody who is able to reconcile those competing goods that we were talking about before, because they have an obligation that goes beyond just being to the corporation. Now, I've got a lawyer sitting next to me here, Joanne. She has an overriding obligation to the courts, which comes before any duty that she owes to MasterCard. And she is bound by that. And in our socio-technical response here, beyond the systems, I think we need to have these stewards with the same professional obligations as ultimately responsible, which goes beyond any duty to a corporation or particularly to governments as well.
Thank you. Joanne, the IAF presents this model where they're cascading ethics down through values, through guiding principles to policies and procedures. And they offer guidance on how a company can do that. I'm interested to get your take from the perspective of MasterCard. Is this a viable proposal? And does, in our increasingly complex data ecosystem, does this idea of a stakeholder-focused data steward and the policies and procedures that the IAF proposes give you enough guidance to do this kind of work at MasterCard?
So I think we're at the beginning of a conversation, right? And I think we're at the beginning of a mind shift and perhaps a cultural shift that has to begin to take hold in our organizations, even organizations like many of us represented here that have taken privacy and data protection very seriously and have processes, systems in place, privacy by design, data by design systems. I think the professor is proposing quite a stronger position for these data stewards than perhaps the paper is representing, and an intriguing one that I think the conversation will continue. We have data stewards at MasterCard. Now, these are relatively new positions for us. Now, certainly we put those individuals in place because we think it's important that data stewards understand their obligations relative to the use of information. But now the paper outlines them to be incrementally more. And so I think to answer your question, yes, the paper is very helpful. The worksheet is very helpful. But if I can take a few minutes to just kind of outline some of the changes that I think the paper encourages organizations to think about, it really does begin to challenge organizations to go from taking data protection measures to a whole new level. It's requiring an additional level of maturity that I think we're all struggling with artificial intelligence, but really does begin to outline it in a very mature way, right? So data stewardship is beyond then the stewardship that we have already encouraged, but to this multi-stakeholder focus, which I think is new. And if we take it to your conclusion, then they would have to be almost slightly independent, closer maybe to the DPO conversations that we've been having. I don't know, and I don't think that so far is something that we've contemplated. Certainly our program has been legal and principles-based, right, and privacy by design-based, but now we're talking about a values-based, ethical-based program that would also be publicly available, right? So that's a sea change as well. Even though we have a transparency report, like many organizations in this room, we've talked about our privacy program, I'm not sure that that's what this paper is talking about. So it's again, a change. It talks about a multi-assessment process throughout the life cycle, as well as systemic assessments, talking about that the systems themselves, the processes themselves need to be thought through. Again, not that we don't do, privacy by design includes the full life cycle, but that's not what this is. This is actually an inherently different way of thinking from the very beginning of how systems are created, which really changes accountability. So it's moving up the accountability curve and really creating, I think, publicly demonstrable values and ethics that I'm not saying organizations haven't been doing, but I do think it's a different level of maturity that we're contemplating ways to do it, but I do think the paper is very, very helpful in pushing the thinking along, as is the worksheet.
That's great, Joanne. Thank you. Warapat. The IAF tries to consider their policy recommendations in a global context, and so do multinational corporations like yours, Intel. How should cultural differences about norms and values impact the way policies are set? Does it help to think in terms of a company's own ethical disposition and the values and principles that flow from that ethos, or is it better to focus on the specifics of the laws in each country where that company does business? Is there a tension between policies guided by ethics and policies guided by regulation and law?
Thank you. That's a lot of questions. Well, first of all, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the host and the organizer for inviting Intel to be part of this very interesting topic of discussion. And well, obviously Intel is like other company on the panel here. We are a multinational company. We have our operations in many parts of the world. And I think in doing that business, I think it's very important for us to understand the local context. And what I mean is just not laws and regulation, but we need to also understand the cultural context and difference in social values, as well as, you know, cultural sensitivity. So these are the factors that would compose to reflect into the enactment of the laws and regulation in individual countries. And this is something that is very important for us. And in that connection, we take that understanding and we bring that into our products and services design, you know. And this is something that we call the privacy by design, or X by design, or whatever by design, right? So this is the process where we sit together with engineers, programmers, lawyers, policy managers, and we're trying to figure out, basically, you know, we come up with the equation and some of the variables. And I think the first variable would be technical requirements. What are the technical requirements that we need to put in? Secondly is regulatory requirements. Now, this is very straightforward. Now we come to the era where machine is evolving, right? Machine is evolving to the next level. And so with the improvement of processing power, memory, algorithm, so I think we need to think about another variable, which is ethics, maybe. So I think, you know, one of the examples that I can mention is the work that we have been doing on autonomous car. This is something that we have been investing a lot, a significant amount of money that we have invested. So basically, there are two levels of thinking in designing this autonomous car. I think the first one would basically be, you know, how we design this autonomous car to have clear communication between the driver and the vehicle, between the vehicle and infrastructure, and also between the network of car itself. So this is to ensure safetyness of the driver. Now the second one would be, you know, how we make sure that the car adapts itself, learning the environment, the changing in environment in each different cultures, right? You know, the car being taught in Southeast Asia would be different from the car being taught in the US or in European country, right? So this is something that we need to think about, and is very important. So another thing that I like to mention, and so we need to have this same system apply, you know, to every new technologies that we develop. For example, like if you see many countries in Southeast Asia, they're still, you know, working and thinking about their privacy laws. So this is a missing part of the law in many countries. And however, you know, thinking from the company value, it's still very important for us to make sure that, you know, we ask our customer to actually provide choice and control for the end user. So even though there's no law regulating that kind of thing, but we still require our customer to make sure that the user has the choice to either agree or not agree. So this is something that we have been doing.
That's great. I'm going to come back to Wojciech on this. Warapat's saying that in many countries, the privacy laws don't exist, and so Intel is moving beyond law already to think about ethics at design. And your comment suggested that this is exactly what the EDPS is suggesting, that there be an ethics by design process. My question is, how does that impact regulations and supervisory authority oversight? If you don't have a specific law that is defining the ethics that must be at play, but instead you have companies expressing their values and designing based on their values and based on their perception of stakeholder interests.
First of all, if there is no law on privacy in this country, there is no regulatory authority, I guess, as well. So this problem can be solved somehow simple. But if you think about the countries that have data protection authority and have the problem of not only applying the legal rules, but also thinking about the accountability in slightly broader context, then it's definitely true. One of my friends, Professor Sellari, who was a speaker at the conference in 2013, once said that the only thing which applies that really drives the attention of the IT people creating the systems, this is a strong panel law and good ethical background. So we have quite a strong law at the moment, but we don't know anything actually about the ethical background that is given to those who are creating the systems. I'm talking also about my own experience. For 7 years of my life, I was a data miner and the person who was creating the logic over data mining in the profiling systems. And I did it just after my studies. I felt myself being well prepared for that, both as the lawyer and as the person who has a lot of experience and is ethically framed. But actually, when I look at the moment to what I was doing when I was 26, 28, 29, I'm a little bit scared because there were quite a lot of goodwill in it, and actually the ethics has been built after that. So what is then the role of the regulator? Well, we decided that the role of the regulator, like EDPS is at the same time promoting ethics and being aware that we understand what the companies, what the organizations, but also what the state authorities think the ethics is. Because this is not only the problem of the organizations like the companies to decide what is ethical, but it's also the problem of the police. It's also the problem of different other enforcement agencies. They also are using a kind of ethics that we have to understand. And the second road that we are taking is the practical approach with the engineers. So we at the same time created the ethical advisory group that is helping us to create the background for our discussion about ethics in the new technologies. And we created so-called IPEN, which is the group of engineers dealing with privacy by design. And actually those roads from different points are leading us to what is the most important for us as the regulator, which is to know how to talk with those who are not lawyers, those who are not only lawyers, those who are seeing that the world does not finish with the text of GDPR.
So it sounds like ethics education needed for regulators, for companies, for engineers.
Yes, you are right, but I would like also to stress that this is not the escape from the fact that we are the regulator.
Yeah.
Because I often hear at the legal conferences that when you don't know what to say, then you say, oh, that's an ethical issue. Or you say, oh, we need more education. So I absolutely agree that we need more education, and it is an ethical issue, but this is not the escape from saying we are the regulator, and our role is to be enforcer of the law.
Can I just comment on that?
Yeah, please.
But it depends on what the regulator then does. So if I could just draw an analogy with the regulation of banks in Australia, APRA, which is our prudential regulator, has a risk culture standard which says we will not tell you what culture you have to have, but you must, as a board of directors, as a bank, declare what you are aiming in terms of the ethical foundations. You must be able to measure whether or not what you say is true, and you must be able to show how you're closing any gaps. So this is the balance that I think Mark was getting to at the beginning. It's not that the regulators withdraw from the field, it's that I think they take a more nuanced approach to how they go about their job, because regulation and good laws are necessary, but as the Commissioner from Hong Kong said, they're not sufficient. Because people will always find loopholes if that's all there is. So it falls then equally back on the company under that kind of regulatory regime to be very specific about these things and to be able to measure it. And it is the kind of sea change that you were talking about, Joanne, but it's a necessary one if we're going to manage to harvest the opportunities in AI and in a way which respects the fundamental dignity people are appealing to.
And it seems like the enhanced accountability that you're calling for and the oversight that regulators would still have on verifying that enhanced accountability would involve more conversation, more discourse, more interaction, and more involvement at design and at review than simply checkbox compliance does. Joanne? Yes. Just
one more sentence about the example that you gave about the banking law and the financial law in Australia and financial systems. We look very closely to the work that was done by the FIA, the authority which was dealing with these subjects on expert systems some years ago. They not only create the guidelines for that, but they were also reviewing what was the use of the expert system and what the problems it created. So that was not one preach at the time of the beginning, but also then the assessment, how it worked in practice, and additional guidelines.
Yeah, but I was talking about something more generic just around expert systems and things. I'm talking about a general approach to regulation.
So Joanne, it sounds like MasterCard is ready to accept the enhanced accountability and already is doing that. Wojciech brings up a very interesting point. Does the 26-year-old engineer developer have the ability to accept the enhanced accountability at design, to do ethics at design.
So I think that there's a difference, though, right? I think that you can't just say, okay, everybody use your ethics, right? I don't think that's what we're talking about. So I think that you have to create a framework for that 26-year-old or 25-year-old or 45-year-old to use, right? There's got to be consistency within the design, within the context of what you're designing. And there's beyond that, there's going to be the additional challenge that, you know, as I was listening to Wopat, we have connected ecosystems of AI as well, right? So it's fine if the AI that MasterCard is creating is using one ethical framework, but then, you know, there's going to be partnerships, right, where I'm using AI that another organization, perhaps Intel, is creating, and, you know, my payment methodologies may be running on systems that are using other artificial intelligence methodologies. And so we have to look at how are all of these different frameworks going to connect up. That's one of the challenges, I think, that we have to look at, because, you know, ethics are one thing, and I think that different contexts, different cultures play into it, different factors. But when you really begin to look at context, partners, ecosystems, it begins to be really important that you begin to spell out for that 26-year-old, what are you talking about at MasterCard, right? Because if I'm not clear inside MasterCard, when I start connecting up my system to the partner system, I better be clear so that 26-year-old is clear, but I need to be clear for my partners, for everyone in the ecosystem.
Yeah, you know, we're experiencing the same at Microsoft, where our engineers and data scientists definitely want to do the right thing, and they want to appropriate the values of the company, but they're often looking for more granular guidance on a difficult decision that they're...
But it can't be check the box either, right?
That's right.
The other
right?
challenge
So maybe
there,
it's culture of an ethical culture, does it require a great deal of education? Does it require different sets of policies, procedures? How does it translate from the top down to the day-to-day work?
Yeah, I think, like Joanne mentioned, you know, ethic is very subjective, I think, you know, even though in the same society, in the same country, we have different ethics, you know, ethics from the people in the city, ethics from the people in the rural area. So it's very subjective and very difficult to define. By the way, I'm an engineer, you know, and I'm not a lawyer, so we're trying to find a way to communicate with the lawyer as well. So, so when the lawyer talking about ethics, honestly, I'm not sure what it is, you know. It's not clear. How are we going to decide things that would technically be ethics?
So it sounds like we need an interdisciplinary language between philosophers, lawyers, engineers.
Well,
Joanne?
and what we're starting to use instead of the word ethics, we're talking, you know, I think it's a broadening of the term, right? It's risk factors, right? It's that, you know, you can't just, I mean, if it's ethics, then my ethics may be different because I'm culturally, we talked about the difference in driving, right, in Asia versus New York, perhaps, right? It's the same thing with ethics. So, but if you can put risk factors, I think that you can begin to...
I want to hear from the philosopher on this. Is it all irreducibly subjective and culturally relative?
It can't be subjective, but it's got to be bound.
But turning it into risk factors is just another ethical system you're bringing to try and restrict it. Look, I think, firstly, the way you were talking about MasterCard having its own sense of its core values and principles.
Which we do.
And then expressing that clearly, not just internally, but across, you know, through its supply chain and all the rest, that becomes, so it starts to be, it's not just about country versus city and things like that. It's about, there is a particular family resemblance that you find in Intel, wherever it happens to be, as there is in MasterCard, wherever it happens, allowing for local variations, but the core DNA. You meet my brothers and sisters, you'll see that we're all very different, but you look at us, we'll say, gosh, those people are related because we share some core DNA. And it's then about making sure, and this is where it gets most difficult, is a lot of organisations will have wonderful words and, you know, have codes and things, but if you look at their other systems and policies, and I'm talking here about what gets measured, what gets remunerated, they're sending very different messages. So the radical implications of what we're talking about here is not just for AI and engineers, it's also for the design of companies. how they organise themselves, their governance, whether good reasons count more than hierarchy, lots of things. So I don't underestimate its difficulty, but it's the only way to deal with the
Let's
challenge.
push on that a little bit. So as I understand the IAF proposal, it's not just enhanced accountability that it's calling for, but enhanced transparency, that the companies actually declare their values and declare this set of, as you're saying, family resemblances between expressions of their values in different instances of their company. And that could be supply chain management as much as data ecosystem management. Does that enhance transparency where the company needs to declare where they stand and then be willing to have oversight from a regulator, come in and say, this is what you committed to, we want to see
it won't just be
the
oversight by
metrics.
the regulator, also the market will make judgments about those things too.
I think you have to be careful here, though, because I think MasterCard has values. We have company values. I'm sure Intel does. I'm sure Microsoft does. And I think when you walk into a MasterCard office, whether you're here in Hong Kong, whether I go to Brussels, whether I go to Singapore, our offices, whether I go to Paris or New York, our offices have the same look and feel. You know you're within the MasterCard family. And we behave, when I get on the phone with a colleague across any of my offices, the family resemblance is very strong because there is, I think, an ethical core, a values-based core to what we do. But I think to say that because I'm now doing artificial intelligence and I need to figure out data-based values and ethics, that I need to now change everything about my organization, I think I could run the risk of boiling the ocean and really have a difficult time getting the change implemented that needs to be implemented to address the challenge at hand. So I want to be, with all due respect, I just want us to be careful here because I think the challenge is big enough. And so I think that there's changes to what many organizations already have in place that are radical enough to take privacy by design and make it ethics by design, and the paper does a good job of laying out what that will require. And I think it does, though, require using the language that you have. But if what we're going to do is start radically changing every organization's values to meet this challenge, we'd be exhausted, and by the time we finish doing that, there would be another challenge, and we would be in a constant do loop. So
such an excellent point, and maybe it's not a radical change. It's a matter of actual consistency.
Absolutely.
In the new
Absolutely.
application. Warapat, you actually brought that up as well. Consistency across applications with a sensitivity to local uses and specific technology. As an engineer, how do you achieve that level of consistency, but also the specific need of the technical application or the application in a particular culture?
Well, I think it's very straightforward in the sense that every design process, there's always a standardization, technical standardization that we need to follow. For example, that if we're going to export our product to one country, there's a certain certification and requirements, from that particular country that would require. However, on top of that product that we design, we actually need to localize it. We need to actually make sure that there's the application or functions that would be suitable for the people. Let's say that you have a smartphone and there's only English, there's no other language. That would be useless to other, to other non-English speaker. So it's something that, we follow the technical standards, we follow regulatory requirements, and then we need to localize it. We need to make sure that the system or the application adapt to the local needs.
Marty, maybe we'll let you have the final word here. There's a question that Warapat's raising, and that's, is there room for international standards, ISO standards, other international bodies certifying on this particular topic, ethics and AI?
So we often debate the question of when is something ready to be built into a code. And I think that eventually we get to the point where you can talk about data stewardship based on enhanced accountability to the point where you have a sense of description that can be then assessed, or that pieces of it can be assessed. I don't think we're there yet. I don't think we're ready for that. But in the last word that I would like to offer, we did truly put this on the table as a discussion paper, as a discussion for a year-long process leading into this question of how do you actually build ethics into advanced analytics, AI, the type of processing we're going to see tomorrow. So in no way did we consider this paper a finished product. We're going to have brainstorming sessions during the year, and we really want people to volunteer to be part of that process.
Well, I think if this panel is any indication, it will be a spirited conversation in the next year. I want to thank our panelists and thank the audience for attending this session, and we hope to continue the conversation afterwards. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Please remain on stage to take a picture and thank you once again, Mr. Abrams, Mr. Hollebeek, and all the panelists for the marvelous discussion. We now come to the next section. This part focuses on the regulating of resources in digital economy, strategies and priorities for leadership and engagement. The regulators and business leaders will discuss the optimum role of data protection authorities and the ways to set priorities, make choices, and maximize effectiveness in this data-driven economy. Some smart solutions and applicable strategies will also be canvassed. Now we will have Mr. Christopher Hodges, a professor of Justice Systems, Center for Socio-Legal Studies of Oxford University in the UK, to be the speaker. And the moderator of this section will be Boana Bellamy. She is the president of Center for Information Policy Leadership, Hunton and Williams, LLP. Yeah, I will leave the time to Ms. Bellamy, and yes, she will introduce the panelists. Thank you.
Wonderful. May I ask the rest of my panel, please, to come and join me. Professor Hodges, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm really delighted to be here. And let me please say on behalf of myself, my colleagues here, my wonderful panel, amazing thank you and congratulations for a really wonderful conference. Commissioner Stephen Wong and your team, you have brought us here all the way east to show us and expose us to the rich culture and tradition, to amazing food and kindness, but also the wisdom and pragmatism. And I think we're going to take a lot of that back home when we start our work on Monday. Remember, we all have to go back to work on Monday. You have showed us yesterday also that wonderful slide about Road and Belt Initiative. Julie Brill mentioned the Silk Road, and indeed, we are now in the space of Silk Road, but it's a digital, virtual Silk Road where data, people, ideas are flowing. And we all here are travelers on that Silk Road because we've been traveling the world, spreading the word of data privacy and best practices. So really delighted to be here. And today we are going to be talking about a topic that really fits very well with the panel that we have heard before. Center for Information Policy Leadership that I lead has been doing huge amounts of work and evangelizing corporate digital responsibility and accountability of organizations, because we think that is the foundation for this modern information age. In the world of fourth industrial revolution, law is not enough to protect our data. At Madrid Conference 2009, I was speaking. Then I was the Chief Privacy Officer at Accenture, and I have said that law is not enough to protect us and our data. We need more. We need corporate best practices, best behaviors. And we are going to continue to do that work. But also, there's a second part of that coin. Not only organizations, but regulators have a role to play. What is the role of regulators in this fourth industrial revolution? How should they behave to uphold fundamental rights, but potentially also to enable our digital Silk Road, the data flows and data innovation and business and societal enablement that happens because of data and information? So how do regulators prioritize their activities? How do regulators achieve best outcomes and best compliance in the marketplace? What are the tools and strategies that they have? Now that is what we're going to be talking about today. And to provoke us, I suppose, we at the Center have published a paper that has been released on Monday. I think you have some copies at the back, but they're virtual copies, of course, on the website, where we set some ideas for that strategizing of priorities, for working for the new DPA of modern fourth industrial revolution. And one of the important elements of that new strategy is also how does regulator work with accountable organization? What does that constructive engagement look like? In our paper, we talk a lot about elements of constructive engagement, and we're going to be talking about some of these tools today. And I think you heard yesterday from Singapore the idea of a regulatory sandbox. Our paper talks about that. I think UK is exploring something like that. Isabelle Falpirotin also said she's doing similar things. So I'm going to be asking our panelists to reflect upon that as well. So with that, I'm going to first ask Professor Christopher Hodges, who is an excellent colleague of ours and has been really partnering with us at the Center to help us formulate this paper. Professor is, of course, from Oxford University. He teaches justice systems there, but he has also written a very a comprehensive book on law and corporate behavior. And I would like to ask Professor to tell us what can we learn from other areas of regulation? What sort of regulation and oversight and behavior from regulators creates the best outcomes from the regulatees? Professor Hodges, please take the podium, if you would like, or you can sit. You would like this?
Thank you very much, Bojana. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My warm thanks and congratulations to the organizers. I worked in Hong Kong 32 years ago for a year, and it's wonderful to be back. I have been back since a bit, but I still remember the original excitement. I am Professor of Justice Systems, which is a most unusual title, and I look at regulatory systems generically and dispute resolution systems as well. So I try to see the wood for the trees amongst a great deal of data. I'm not an expert in data protection, but the question that I try and ask is, how's it going to work? What's the architecture, and how is it going to work in practice? When I look at regulatory systems, broadly speaking, there's a front end and a back end. The front end is the rules, the back end is traditionally, quote, enforcement. Certainly that terminology is perhaps a little out of date already. When I look at the GDPR, there is almost no enforcement policy in it. In fact, the EU, because of the principle of subsidiarity, has no enforcement policy for any of the internal market legislation, apart from one or two things which are subject to European level enforcers like competition law. And indeed, most of the member states don't have enforcement legislation either, enforcement policies, sorry. The basic proposition is you have a rule, someone breaches the rule, you might prosecute them, and magically everything is wonderful after that. Life isn't like that, and most advanced regulators are dealing with that thing. So when I look at the GDPR, I see only a couple of points embryonically emerging. One is public enforcement with fines up to 4%. That's not very impressive. Competition does 10%. Come on. And private enforcement with a number of litigation provisions. It just assumes they'll be there. How they integrate, what the approaches are completely unspecified. And the national DPAs don't put this in writing either, other than the UK, as far as I'm aware. So the questions, therefore, is, if you're a regulator, how do you enforce? How do you achieve compliance? What is your enforcement policy? What changes when you impose a large sanction? or do something else on a company or an individual? How do you know that your enforcement policy or your general actions actually produce change? Convert that from if you're a regulator to saying if you are a company, if you're a senior manager, if you're compliance, if you're human resources, etc., ask exactly the same questions within a company, because they ought to be the same. Another point, if you were a business and you're basically trying to do the right thing most of the time and you believe you're doing that, and an authority comes along and imposes a 4% of turnover fine on you, what are you going to do next time? Are you going to be cooperative, or are you going to try and avoid and hide things, basically? So the basic question is not how do you enforce, it's not how do you deter, it's how do you affect behavior. Now, that takes us towards basically behavioral psychology and indeed towards ethics. When I look at regulatory systems, the most advanced ones across the world are all talking about the same points. They're all moving towards risk-based approaches and outcomes-based approaches. So you measure what you do by what happens. Do you get fair, equitable results and the right sort of results within outcomes? Can you measure that? Can you show it? Previous regulatory systems are all about rules. We're now trying to thin them out and to have principles-based. Very similar to a matrix of basically saying, let's have some ethical principles, because if they've got to be principles or values, they've got to be ethical by definition, but most regulators don't say that. They've got to be ethical because that's what we expect within common humanity shared DNA in relation to right and wrong. So if you move towards principles-based and you then apply it, there's also a model UK government promulgated beginning of this year about regulated self-assurance. And this is an attempt to mediate, as it were, between old, what's called command and control type regulation and self-regulation. In other words, either you're controlled all the time or you just do it voluntarily. The middle space is the practical one, sometimes called co-regulation. So the point about this is that it's saying whoever you are, actually whether you're a public organization or a private organization, you're in charge of what you're doing. So you ought to think all the time, if you have actually got a system in place and a value system in place, that means that you have good outcomes and you're making the right decision. You control it. Don't just try and game the rules and comply with some of the rules and try and get around others. You do it all the time. And within that sort of system, it's extra collaboration, basically, and extra data and extra transparency between regulator and regulated. Same point within a company as in the public regulatory space. If you then ask the question, how do people observe rules? There's a great deal of economic theory which has dominated since the 1950s, and most of that is now shown to be completely theoretical and doesn't apply to humans. Although I read a paper by a very distinguished competition regulator yesterday, which is still using economic theory of rational actors in its enforcement policy and talking about deterrence. It just doesn't work for humans in regulating future behavior. Other things like behavioral psychology, known as behavioral economics or behavioral insights or nudge, are actually the state of the art at the moment. Quite a few systems, the most impressive regulatory systems, focus on asking not just something's happened so we'll punish it, but saying why did it happen? Indeed, airlines say, and there was a reference this morning, humans are our weakest link. So I don't care if a pilot or an air traffic controller or whatever made a mistake. Why did they do it? So why would any human in that position make the same mistake again? How do we design that out or train or do something? Root cause analysis, well-known technique. You then take that further forward into applying it, affecting behavior. You don't expect everything to be right all the time. You've got to start where people are and improve over time. And the best regulators do that and urge people forward. And you also do redress and putting things right as you go on. Most sensible companies, and there are plenty of public government statements like this, try and do the right thing most of the time. So therefore, let's think about that and leverage it. Now, there's quite a few commercials in this presentation. The first one is the very large book that's already been referred to. Don't buy it, but you need to know it's there. The short version is 800 pages. The Department for Business in the UK said no one's going to read that. In fact, quite a few have. But write it in 10 pages. So this is a 10-page point, if you want to look at it, which is really my sort of amateur attempt to summarize the behavioral psychology. That has now given rise to a number of pilot studies about saying, let's put this into practice in regulatory systems, relationships between regulators and companies. How do you enforce? Here are two models. The one on the left is primitive, but far too many people do it. It is, in fact, the economic model of deterrence, as it happens, but you can see this in the Middle Ages or any authoritarian regime. You go around and hit people or shoot them or kill them. If you were one of those small people at the bottom, would you want to cooperate with the regulator? Would you hide most of the time what you're doing? The one on the right is 19th century, and that's two Victorian gentlemen, say, in the City of London, who agree, but actually, and therefore they're both going to achieve better outcomes because they're agreeing, not one of them beating the other one up. But actually the thing that makes them work is the club around them. Now, the 19th century club has obviously got a number of problems. It's restrictive. So the question now for the 21st century is, how do we replicate that in relationships within companies, between companies and others, within regulators, etc.? And there are some answers here. This is a diagram that's used by a number of enforcers, regulators. I can think of revenue tax authorities or environmental authorities who do this, who say we need to treat people differently. We need to segment who's who. You may well have a criminal at the left-hand end, in other words, a hacker in this industry, or a pornographer, or a terrorist, international financial badness, etc. What do? Well, actually, you hit them. The medieval primitive approach, because you can't do much else. At the right-hand end, you've got someone who's absolutely doing the right thing all the time. What do you do with them? You recognize them, you learn from what they're doing, and you reward them. I was thinking this morning, it'd be rather amusing if actually the DPAs went around handing out monetary rewards rather than fines on the left-hand end. Fortunately, there are other currencies that you can use, such as 5 stars, which are used for restaurants, or kite marks, or awards, and celebrating best practice like Company X. Many are in the middle. So what do? You move into education, enabling, engaging, helping people forward from where they are. That's most of the space, and that works, basically. Therefore, a spectrum of motivations, segmentation about where people are. Now, how do you know where people are? They have to prove it through what was being said in the previous panel, which is their statements about what they believe and the outcomes that they produce, basically. So this is a challenge, and it's the same challenge for regulators as well as commercial companies, to say what you believe and then prove you do it. Now, that needs a slight readjustment, which point came up in the previous panel, about how things work and what we're doing, but actually not much of a readjustment. In relation to enforcement, one should recognize that the two dimensions of looking backwards and looking forwards. You can impose big penalties, but they basically are a question of looking backwards in relation to previous actions. They don't much affect, usually, future behavior. So if you're going to affect future behavior, you have to be more sophisticated than using the big stick. Behavioral psychology supports, therefore, using constructive engagement, motivating voluntary compliance, a values-based culture, which basically comes down to the issue of fairness, And it's no point trying to avoid the issue by saying, oh, well, ethics are just ethics, it doesn't matter. Let's look at some outcomes and some detail about what people are actually doing, and it's perfectly possible to establish that and prove this. And therefore you have the trust in the relationships between the two Victorians. They achieve more by engaging and discussing, sorting out problems. So there's all the difference in the world. So if I went up to a competition authority and said, I've just found a cartel, a couple of idiots in the company are involved in this, the company would then, the regulator would then fine me hundreds of millions of whichever currency, unless I was the first to own up. That incentivizes being the first to own up. It doesn't actually incentivize me to stop or find the cartel. Now, there are plenty of other regulatory systems within which you can go to a regulation and say, I've got a problem, what's the solution? That one is going to work more quickly. So the outlines of all this about a model which is holistic in relation to everything companies do and regulators do are in the back of this book. And I didn't actually write the last two chapters, which are the real core of how you do it. My friend Ruth did. And the point is, it's not just about ethics by design, it's ethics in marketing, accounting, pricing, everything you do, look at the outcomes holistically, and that actually works. It's very good for business, it's very good for society, it saves regulators a lot of time and effort. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chris. I'm going to ask Richard Thomas to come and join us now, just to sort of tell us how does this, these learnings that we can take from other regulation, how does that translate into data protection? So Richard, please come here, and I'm going to pick up my stuff so it doesn't bother you. There we are. Are we doing rotating chairs? Okay, fine. I'll sit here. Just put back the slides, please. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, good morning. It's a real pleasure to be here. I think this is my 19th out of 39 international conferences, and I'm bound to say, with great diplomacy, this ranks amongst the best, but I'll say no more. Well done, Hong Kong. I think a fantastic conference. Bjorn has given me 4 minutes to summarize the discussion paper. Is it coming in?
This button here.
No, it's
There.
torn as ours.
Yeah, the big one.
Here we are. No, it's not the same slides. Never mind. I will. Okay, I will make it up. The discussion paper, which the Centre has published this week, Strategies and Priorities for Leadership and Engagement, it attempts to summarize Professor Hodges' 800 pages, which don't mention data protection, but mention virtually every other sphere of regulation. Underlying what Professor Hodges does in relation to DPAs are some not frequently asked questions. What is effectiveness for DPAs? What results are DPAs trying to achieve? What does success for a DPA look like? How do they know when they've done a good job? And fundamentally, how can effectiveness be maximized within the context of increased responsibilities and limited resources? As this slide indicates, one of the absolute key messages of our discussion paper is that DPAs simply cannot do everything. If you look at the GDPR, there are 21 separate duties, legally imposed duties, on the shoulders of each DPA across the European Union, plus 27 powers. DPAs have very, very meagre resources, absolutely, and by comparison to other regulators. So there has to be a fundamental need to set strategic priorities, to make some hard choices. When I was the UK Commissioner for 7 years, my slogan was selective to be effective. Our paper now elaborates this. The new slogan is a results-based approach. based on prioritizing functions and tackling issues of greatest risk. And I have to say, fairly bluntly and perhaps provocatively, without clear strategies, there are real risks. There are risks of overwhelmed and ineffective DPAs, risks of inadequately protected individuals, risks of confused and frustrated regulated organizations, and risks of reputational damage for privacy and data protection. So you need to prioritize. Our discussion paper attempts to group all the functions of DPAs under 4 main headings: leadership, police officer, complaint handler, and authorizer. And we argue fairly strongly, again drawing upon Professor Hodges' work and the work of other academics and other writers, and strong empirical evidence, that the top priority for DPAs should be leadership aligned with constructive engagement. In other words, guiding and supporting good practice and engaging with accountable regulatees. Putting it crudely, carrots generally work better than sticks, but, and I think this point's been made, you still need a powerful stick for occasional use. But we argue that the police officer role, using or threatening that stick, should not be normally the first port of call. It should be reserved for deliberate, willful, or seriously negligent conduct. Complaint handling function. The problem with complaint handling, it's hugely important for the individuals, but it does not normally change the behavior of the organizations. And it's demand-led, it's very resource-intensive, and we argue that good complaint handling needs skilled triage, clear selection criteria to avoid swamping the DPA, to justify more detailed investigation of particular complaints, and to use complaints as the all-important source of intelligence for the DPA. And we also argue that the authorizer role, where the authority of the DPA is needed, is somewhat less important these days. It's not a strategic function, but perhaps there are some criteria for a class-based approach. Well, we've used the phrase constructive engagement a few times today, and our paper explores this in one complete section. It gives various examples of what we mean by constructive engagement. First and foremost, it means transparency in the way the regulator, the DPA, works. Perhaps we should now be talking about accountable DPAs. It also means as much practical guidance to the world out there as possible. Concrete guidance, in plain language, targeted, not simply one size fits all, targeted on different sorts of regulated organizations. Constructive engagement is a two-way process with accountable organizations, but it needs from the DPA maximum consultation, participation, frank exchanges. It can involve regulated self-assurance, reliance upon certification, seal marks, self-certification, accountability, exploiting these new thoughts in the rules for data protection. Many regulators elsewhere give incentives for good faith compliance. We heard a bit about that this morning. Good, modern, effective regulators exploit herd instincts amongst organizations. It's very clear that organizations follow leaders in their field. DPAs need to identify the leaders, work with them, and encourage the rest to follow behind. And it involves creating space for responsible innovation. We've already had mentioned today regulatory sandboxes, which the pioneers are the financial service regulators, where they're now exploring the possibility for allowing very controlled experimentation of techniques in what I might call the grey areas of regulation. Constructive engagement is perhaps summarized in this diagram. I won't go into detail on that, but that shows all the main players. The main players are effective DPAs and accountable regulatees, but there are many other forces at work, all leading to the all-important outcomes in terms of better protected individuals and society. Well, moving forward, absolutely we are not telling DPAs how to do their job. That is not our role. The DPAs may find some interesting ideas in our paper. There may be food for thought for each DPA individually or perhaps collectively at the international level. We have suggested some principles which try to tease out the essence of our paper and possibly a protocol for putting a bit more concrete flesh on that, but it's very much for the DPA community to decide whether this makes any sense or not. We have set some questions in our paper. It's genuinely a discussion paper, and perhaps some of these might be taken forward over the next 12 months and looked at this time at the conference next year. The paper is on the CIPL website, and I do hope that everybody here, DPAs and others, looks at the principles, the protocol, and the questions, and please do engage in discussion with us. Thank you very much.
Richard, thank you very much for that. Now we can all sit very comfortably in our chairs. Let me then very quickly ask Alon Bachar, who is the head of Data Protection Authority in Israel, a small country, a small DPA, but incredibly resourceful, incredibly smart, and also in a country where there is a huge push for digitalization and innovation. How do you set your priorities? You have heard what Richard said, where your priorities lie, and how do you also balance this need to protect fundamental rights and privacy, but also enable digital innovation and data-driven economy in Israel?
Thank you, Brianna, for inviting me to speak in this very important discussion. I think this paper should be a food for thought for every regulator that wants to be relevant and effective. ELITA has gone through major changes in the past year, and the changes correspond with the discussion paper because they aim mainly to achieve engagement. In addition, ELITA's policy with regards to choosing its enforcement tools is aimed to achieve leadership and engagement. ELITA changed its structure and added 3 new functions in the last year that focus on engagement. One of them is an innovation and policy development department, an auditing function, and the Strategic Alliances Department. It's a new department. The Innovation Policy Development Department was established to enable ELITA to be an initiating regulator rather than a responding one. The new department tasked with the mission of identifying developing business, social and technological trends, and to initiate compatible, innovative regulatory solutions. Identifying new trends will enable ELITA to publicize its policy ahead of time, to engage with the stakeholders, and to enable the industry to implement privacy-enhancing solutions in the development stage. The audit function enables ELITA to reach out to a wide range of sectors and organizations to receive information, examine practices, and their compliance with the law, and this will enable ELITA to implement soft regulation. That's how we call it, in appropriate cases. In order to be efficient, the first part of this audit would be outsourced. And the last new department is the Department of Strategic Alliances. It was established as a new department for, we want to establish and create and promote a meaningful public debate on privacy in Israel, and engage the public in order to establish privacy protection awareness. We think that we lack in this area. The department is responsible for media, for policy delivery, communication, training, and education, and we put a lot of efforts in this area. So it's clear that I agree with the fact that an effective regulator gives high priority for leadership with constructive engagement. ELITA engages with the industry on a regular basis. However, in the complaint handling issue, I agree that complaint handling needs criteria, and we want to avoid swamping. You're right, and we think that an effective regulator should not implement enforcement action in each case a complaint was received. And the Israeli courts are behind us in this position. We think that an effective regulator uses complaints as an intelligence tool, and in order to identify harsh breaches that require investigating while assisting affected individuals in less harsh cases. When we see a big amount of complaints on a specific subject, and we realize that the regulatory regime is not clarified enough, these complaints can be a trigger for issuing specific guidelines and not for enforcement. And regarding the enforcement recommendation, that's the place that don't agree completely with your paper, and I think I'm the regulator, the big regulator with the big stick, but with no beard. I think that deterrence and punishment is not less effective than the engagement. I believe that the secret is a balanced combination between the two. Speak softly and carry a big stick. It's not mine, but we try to use it. I think this should be the motto of every regulator that wants to be relevant, but to achieve compliance. I think engagement will only be effective when the regulated stakeholders know that the regulator holds a big stick and that he will not hesitate to use it in the right place. So I don't know if we need a lot of time, more time, but the enforcement scheme of RITA is aimed to achieve these points and parts, and if we'll have time, we'll elaborate.
Well, thank you very much. I'm hearing lots of buzzwords, starting with risk-based approach for regulators, outcome-based, measurable, selective to be effective, and now speak softly and carry big stick. But also you have said something which is really important, which is issue-led regulation versus responsive regulation its own. Let's talk about constructive engagement. Stephen Dedman, you are Deputy Chief Privacy Officer of Facebook. Tell us, first of all, or help us understand what motivates corporate behavior. How do companies behave internally in respect to regulators and regulated areas? And what are perhaps some of the best initiatives we can do to improve constructive engagement? Because I know Facebook has been doing some as well.
Thanks, Bianca. So good afternoon, everybody. There are many, many drivers for corporate behavior. Obviously, there's the desire to win in the market, to be successful with your customers, there's reputation, and there's regulation, just to name three. And a combination of those is nearly always the case. So this is the problem we're trying to solve here. What type of regulatory behavior is going to cause the right type of corporate behavior to produce the outcomes that we want as a society? It's like, does A plus B equal C? That's fundamentally what we're looking at. If you don't know what those three ingredients are, then we're not going to necessarily get to the right outcome. I want to throw one thing on the table here which we haven't really talked about, which is the subject matter of this conference. This is all about privacy, data protection. Professor Hodges referred to lots of different forms of regulation, regulating many different things, and has seen commonalities across these in terms of what type of regulatory behavior is effective. But when we think about the things that we discuss at this conference and many other conferences around the world, the solutions to what we're talking about are not obvious and they're non-trivial. So I'll take one example, and it's a universal issue that we discuss in the world of privacy, which is how do we give people transparency over the use of their data? That's a really easy thing to say. It's a really hard thing to get right. And we almost universally say we haven't fixed this problem. We need to spend more time helping people understand how to use their data. We need to educate people. In reality, what we need to do is we need to rethink privacy to give them better transparency. What's needed is innovation. What's needed is investment, is the kind of creative skills that many of our companies use to create great products and services need to be deployed to addressing this question of transparency to make it actually meaningful for people, so that it's not continually confusing and they're not continually failing to understand complex terms and conditions and the like. So if we think again about types of regulatory behavior, if a regulator is in the posture of police officer, what sort of behavior does that cause a company to exhibit? Well, if you get taken to the police station and arrested by a police officer and they say you've got one phone call, who do you call? You call your lawyer. And when you call your lawyer, when a company calls its lawyer, it's not in a process of thinking about innovating and creating and investing. It's hunkering down and defending, right? And that hunkering down and defending, that adversarial process might be fine for different types of problems. It may produce the kind of behaviors that companies need to produce a simple solution. But in the area that we're looking at, when companies should be investing energy and time and creativity to solve these problems, that's the last thing they're going to do. They're focusing on defense, and they should be focusing on investing their resources in producing the right types of outcomes that we want. So to your question, Brianna, the sorts of regulatory behavior for many of the problems that we're talking about in relation to privacy requires the regulator to adopt the posture, as Richard's paper talks about, as leader, collaborative leader to help organizations trying to achieve an objective which will try and do the right thing, which is build transparency, solve a difficult problem, to come together to collaborate and invest the right type of resources to do that.
Do you want to share with us, and I know you have shared this at your wonderful dinner that you organized the other night, but for those who were not there, sort of some of the initiatives Facebook has been doing in kind of collaborative, first of all, constructive engagement, I think, but also collaborative engagement, and finally, reiterative compliance that you and I have talked about, and that's the Design Jam. So,
yeah. So, thanks for that prompt. So I just alluded to a problem of the way we talk about transparency. So we often say, let's educate people because privacy is really complicated and they should understand it. What we're basically saying there is we need to redesign people to fit privacy, when really we should be turning the spotlight back on ourselves and saying, no, we need to redesign privacy to fit people. And that means accepting people as we find them, which is that they're actually quite busy and they don't want to be lawyers and they want to get on with their lives and they've got many really important things to be doing. And so we need to build a system, a way of engaging with them, giving them choices and information that works for them. So that really means understanding people. And it's the bit in the discussions we have that often gets left out. So an initiative that we kicked off earlier this year, which we called Design Jam, so nothing particularly new in design and talking about privacy by design, but it's really a design thinking methodology to think through complicated problems when there are questions of law, questions of technology, and there's the human dimension to try and find creative ways to best get the best outcome for people. And it's something that we've done with lots and lots of external partners, because at Facebook we have some really smart people, some great designers, but we don't have all the answers. We can throw huge amounts of resources at this, but we will only get to the answers through constant application, constant innovation, constant trying and failing. You know, we're going to fail and then get back up again and try again. The success of that method is that it brings multiple perspectives together. And for it to be effective and for it to be seen as being legitimate, it absolutely has to have the involvement of regulators. But regulators wearing their leadership cap, not their policeman cap, because that's not going to get the outcome we want.
Thank you, Stephen. Scott, I would like to, because we are in the East and we've come East, what can we learn from compliance and corporate behaviors in East, and what works here? Sticks or carrots or something third?
Thanks, Brianna, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a good question, and the evolution of privacy regimes in Asia is somewhat behind markets in Europe. Over the last 5 years, we've seen a rapid rise of those regimes and an increase in the amount of enforcement and sanctions. I guess the first observation I would make about the carrot versus stick is that there are certainly a lot of organisations in this part of the world that require the existence of a big stick. And in simple terms, there are many organisations we've been dealing with who to date have done nothing about privacy whatsoever in this region because the quantum of fines was not seen as sufficiently high enough to justify what they perceived to be the amount of investment required to fix the problems. All of a sudden, GDPR is on the horizon, 4% of global turnovers happening. One of my colleagues from Amsterdam was over this week and we ran an event in our office and we were oversubscribed with clients who didn't want to talk privacy for the last few years. all of a sudden they're very interested in, hang on, it can get me here. Hang on, it's 4% of my global turnover. I'm a big company. So I think the reality is that there is an element of stick that is necessary. However, in defence of the lawyers, we are actually working at more than selling fear. And yes, we do get those phone calls when something goes wrong and you're in the police station or the equivalent thereof. However, I've certainly been working with a lot of organisations about using privacy compliance as a business enabling tool, as a means by which they can understand more about their own business. At its simplest, when we first start doing things like compliance work with a client, we try to help them understand what information they hold, where they're getting it from, where they're storing it, who they're transferring it to. That data audit process reveals an awful lot of information that perhaps an organisation didn't realise. In fact, in my experience, they really didn't understand what they had. And the mere fact of uncovering that and identifying it and putting it down in a data map is in actually enabling them to do more creative things, to extract value out of that incredible resource that they have that they didn't necessarily know about. And I guess, thinking about this topic, and we had a chance for a chat a couple of weeks ago ahead of this, and I gave it some thought, I think the regulators need to turn their attention to how do we make this a win for organisations? And how do we make it a win for organisation in those areas that really gets their attention? And let's be honest, that is often about commercial imperative. They want to make money. They want to extract value out of what they have. So how does a regulator go about actually encouraging that? And I think that's something that's perhaps missing from certainly the regimes at the moment. The other comment I would make as well is that there is a tendency, I think, to speak about privacy often without sufficient reference to the objectives of the individuals that it's supposedly protecting. I'm old, so I tend to have a view of privacy that's probably quite traditional. And when we do projects in Hong Kong's a great place for shopping, and when I hear of people that are going to track me around shopping centres and start hitting me with offers from shops as I go past them, I get a bit scared. My team, however, they really like that, and they're quite excited about that. And I think we need to understand that there are very different objectives from those individuals, and that the regulators need to be attuned to that. And full 100% privacy compliance is not necessarily meeting the objectives of the underlying individuals that it's supposed to protect.
Thank you for that. In fact, this paper does try to actually tease some of these things. What are the outcomes you want to achieve and the results? And if we do achieve these results, then we should be happy about it. I do want to remind us, thank you, Scott, for talking about Asia and East, because Professor Horiba yesterday spoke about this culture of compliance and self-regulation in Japan, in Hong Kong, in Singapore, Australia. There are big pushes by regulators and privacy commissioners to incentivize privacy management programs and for organizations to be accountable, to do good, because it is, as Richard would say, another buzzword, it's in their self-enlightened interest to actually behave well. And I think I'm being told we kind of have 1 minute. Can I ask one of you, each of you, in 10 seconds to give one thought to the audience, what they should be thinking about, concentrating about this weekend before they go back, and then I'm going to have a last word. Professor Hodges.
In what circumstances do you use the big stick? You may need it. So in what circumstances are both regulators and companies going to affect behavior, and how? I think the answer is basically an ethical culture and a collaborative relationship. The models exist, and it can be adopted within data protection.
Thank you. Stephen?
I think it's, the question is, how do you incentivize a company to innovate to solve the sorts of problems we spend endless hours discussing at these conferences? It's about innovation, investment, creativity. That's what's needed.
Doing it. Scott?
Turning the world on its head here, the best place for me to control my privacy rights, and it is my right, is not by hundreds of companies out there having forms that they've collected that I never read and tick boxes on. How do we actually go about converting that back into a privacy ID that I control?
Alan?
I recommend to think about innovative tools that will enable you not to use your sticks.
Brilliant.
If you're a DPA, how can you best engage? If you're a company, how can you best engage?
Wonderful. And with that, I'm actually going to close with a wonderful saying that I reminded myself by famous Chinese philosopher Lao Tzu, and I apologize, I don't probably pronounce that very well, who said, a journey of 1,000 miles starts with the first step. I think we have taken a giant step at this conference. And also, my fellow digital Silk Road travelers, I hope you're going to join us for lunch, because I think it is time to have lunch, and you can't do a journey without having a full stomach as well. So thank you very much for this. We are here for the rest of the conference, and the paper is in the back.